Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepy Broadcast channel. I hope this finds you all doing well today. In this video, we are going to walk through 2 wild fan theories for every single character in Family Guy, the kind of thing that works perfectly to fall asleep to or just unwind with. Before we begin though, I would like to gently ask you to hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it genuinely helps us keep improving the videos for this wonderful community we have managed to build. Anyway, that is enough of that. Let's get started. First on the list is Peter Griffin, and the idea that the entire series unfolds inside his head. One of the most unsettling ideas in Family Guy lore claims that nothing we watch on screen ever actually takes place. A popular reading that grew out of Reddit threads argues that Peter Griffin lost his whole family in a drunk driving crash he was responsible for, and that everything we see across hundreds of episodes exists only within his shattered mind. In this version, Peter built an elaborate imaginary world where death can be undone, time can be rewound, and his family can be kept alive forever, precisely because he cannot come to terms with what he did. It explains why characters die and reappear with no justification, why wounds vanish in an instant, and why every episode snaps back to normal as though nothing had occurred. When you go looking through the actual canon, the theory draws support from dozens of moments that suggest reality itself warps around Peter's consciousness. The starting point for all of this is the way death behaves in Family Guy. Brian is struck by a car in one episode, and the whole Griffin household grieves him for weeks. Stewie eventually uses his time machine to stop the accident from happening, and just like that, Brian is back, with no one but Stewie retaining any memory that he ever died. The show frames this as a real alteration of the timeline, but it also proves that death carries no lasting weight in this universe. Characters can perish and return without consequence, because the ordinary rules of reality simply do not hold. If Peter constructed this world inside his guilt-ridden mind after killing his real family behind the wheel while drunk, it follows naturally that he would design a reality where death can always be reversed. He needs his family to come back no matter the circumstances, because confronting their permanent absence would obliterate him. Brian may be the clearest window into Peter's psyche under this reading. He embodies everything Peter secretly wishes he were: educated, cultured, well-read, and politically engaged. Peter himself is overweight, crude, and frequently oblivious, while Brian carries the intellectual side that Peter either buried or never developed at all. Whenever Peter speaks with Brian, he is essentially conversing with an idealized version of his own conscience. Brian even shares Peter's drinking problem, but he dresses his habit up as refined wine appreciation rather than cheap beer, which lets Peter examine his own alcoholism through a character who makes addiction look sophisticated instead of ruinous. Because Brian is a dog rather than a person, there is emotional distance built in, so Peter can wrestle with his demons through Brian without owning them directly as his own failures. When Brian dies, Peter's subconscious cannot bear it, so Stewie sets everything right by traveling through time. Peter needs Brian because Brian is the part of himself that still thinks and reflects. Stewie is an even stranger case. He is an infant who constructs time machines, produces clones, hops between parallel universes, and wields technology that outstrips anything in the real world. Sometimes the people around him understand every word he says, and other times they treat him like an ordinary babbling baby. The series has never actually settled whether anyone truly hears Stewie speak or whether his grand schemes happen at all. That inconsistency fits perfectly if Stewie stands in for Peter's craving to command time and reality. After causing the crash that killed his family, Peter's mind conjured a character capable of bending time itself. Stewie can go back and repair mistakes, which is exactly what Peter longs to do with his own life. Stewie's towering intellect also makes up for Peter's lack of schooling and foresight. Through Stewie, Peter gets to imagine what unlimited power and intelligence would feel like. The fact that Stewie is at once a baby and a criminal mastermind suggests he functions more as a concept than a person. He is Peter's fantasy of beginning again with perfect knowledge, and simultaneously, Peter's rage and hunger for control given form. Lois operates as Peter's idealized wife, the one who somehow endures everything he does. Real marriages collapse under far less pressure than what Peter heaps on Lois throughout the series. He has put her life in danger countless times, embarrassed her in public, forgotten their anniversary again and again, and pulled off an endless parade of idiocy that would push any real person toward divorce. Yet Lois stays and keeps loving him in spite of it all. She flares up within individual episodes, but by the closing minutes, she has always forgiven him. If Peter invented this fantasy, of course he would craft a wife who never truly abandons him, no matter what he does. The real Lois died in the accident Peter caused, and he cannot live with the thought that she died hating him or disappointed in him. Fantasy Lois forgives everything because Peter is desperate for her forgiveness. The show occasionally gestures toward darker corners of Lois's character, including her history with wealthy men and her occasional affairs, but those beats feel engineered to ease Peter's guilt about his own shortcomings as a husband. If Lois was not perfect either, then Peter can convince himself the marriage was complicated rather than admit he ruined something good. Meg is the family member everyone treats with open contempt and cruelty. Peter flatly tells her he does not love her. The family uses her as a verbal punching bag, and multiple episodes revolve around how nobody values her at all. That makes no sense in a real household, but it turns chilling within this theory. If Peter killed his family while drunk, Meg might represent the specific guilt he carries about his daughter. Perhaps the real Meg suffered the most in the crash, or perhaps Peter had an unresolved, troubled relationship with his actual daughter. In his imagined world, he recreates Meg, but keeps her at arm's length through constant ridicule. He cannot love fantasy Meg, because doing so would force him to face how deeply he loved and lost the real one. The abuse Meg absorbs is Peter's self-punishment redirected onto her. Every cruel joke at her expense echoes the internal voice telling Peter he deserves to suffer for what he did. The show even gave us an episode where Meg finally confronts the family and explains that she tolerates their abuse because it holds everyone together, which implies her role as a scapegoat serves a psychological purpose for the whole family, Peter most of all. Chris comes across as a simpler figure who mirrors Peter's personality, only younger and less finished. He loves art and drawing, a creative path Peter never took. If this fantasy lives in Peter's mind, Chris embodies the potential Peter sees in a son, the person Peter wishes he had grown into. Chris is overweight like his father, but he still has time to turn out differently. He is dim in the same ways Peter is, yet he has not yet committed the catastrophic mistakes that came to define his father's life. Chris also gets more warmth from Peter than Meg does, possibly because Peter can accept a son who resembles him but cannot accept a daughter he failed to protect. The series sometimes paints Chris as disturbed or strange, such as the evil monkey in his closet that eventually turns out to be real. Those touches hint that even inside his fantasy, Peter cannot keep everything pristine. Darkness leaks in through Chris because Peter's subconscious knows something is profoundly wrong. The wider cast around the Griffins reinforces the theory by functioning more like archetypes than fully formed people. Joe Swanson is the perfect friend who forgives Peter endlessly, despite being paralyzed partly because of their adventures together. A real person in Joe's position might carry resentment, but Joe stays loyal because he exists in Peter's mind as the friend Peter wishes he deserved. Cleveland Brown moved away for several seasons, and then returned with the show barely noting it, his presence dictated entirely by whether Peter's fantasy happens to need him. Quagmire serves as Peter's ID, the sexual appetites and dark urges Peter cannot admit to himself. Quagmire does things that would land anyone in prison in the real world, yet in Peter's fantasy, he faces almost no consequences, because he represents desires Peter has but refuses to claim. On the occasions when Quagmire turns on Peter and reveals how much he despises certain things about him, those moments feel like Peter's own self-awareness breaking through the fantasy to remind him what he really is. The very structure of a Family Guy episode supports the notion that all of this lives in Peter's damaged mind. Nearly every installment follows the same arc. Peter does something foolish, triggers a disaster, faces some fallout, and then everything resets by the next episode. The family forgives him, injuries evaporate, and life returns exactly to where it started. Real life does not work that way. Actions leave permanent marks, and relationships erode under repeated betrayals and failures. But in a fantasy built by someone who cannot accept consequences, everything can reset forever. Peter can repeat the same mistakes endlessly because he is essentially trapped in a loop of his own guilt. He keeps staging scenarios in which he fails his family, only to be handed another chance to try again. The reset button is Peter's inability to move past the trauma of what he did. The cutaway gags that define the show's comedy fit this reading unnervingly well. Peter constantly invokes experiences and memories that make no logical sense, like meeting various celebrities or living through historical events, and these tangents erupt in the middle of ordinary conversations while other characters barely react. If the whole show is happening in Peter's head, the cutaways represent his mind wandering, leaping from one association to the next, the way a traumatized or intoxicated person loses the thread. Peter cannot hold a stable reality together even inside his own fantasy, because his mind is too broken. The cutaways show his consciousness splintering and reassembling over and over as he tries to escape the truth of what he did. The series has given us multiple episodes where the characters realize they are inside a television show, or where reality dissolves entirely. In one, the family discovers they are cartoons being watched by live-action humans. In another, everything inexplicably becomes a Conway Twitty concert. These beats are played for laughs, but they also suggest that the reality of Family Guy is unstable and aware of its own artificiality. If Peter imagined all of it, his subconscious occasionally punches through to remind him none of it is real. The characters admit to being cartoons because that is precisely what they are inside Peter's mind, drawings and constructs rather than living people. Death and violence occur constantly in the show with no lasting impact. Peter has been shot, stabbed, blown up, and mangled in ways that would kill an ordinary human many times over. He tumbles down and clutches his knee for an eternity as a running gag, yet he never visits a hospital or contends with chronic pain. Characters routinely kill one another in cutaways and flashbacks without any legal or moral fallout in the main storyline. This total disregard for mortality makes sense if Peter's mind invented a world where death cannot genuinely happen, because he cannot process the real deaths he caused. He needs violence to be meaningless, so he can avoid confronting the meaningful violence he committed. The show's elastic timeline supports the theory as well. The Griffins have been a family with teenage kids for more than 2 decades of real-world time, yet none of them age. Stewie stays a baby episode after episode despite the years slipping by. The show references modern technology and current events, proving time moves forward in some sense, and still the family remains frozen at the exact ages they were when it began. If Peter created this fantasy after killing his family, he would naturally lock them at the ages they were when they died. He cannot picture them growing older because they never got the chance. His fantasy lets him preserve them exactly as they were in that final moment before everything fell apart. Peter's relationship with alcohol ties every strand of this theory together. He drinks constantly across the series, and his alcoholism drives countless plots. He gets drunk and makes disastrous choices that endanger everyone around him, again and again. The show minds this for laughs, but within the theory, Peter's drinking is both the origin of his trauma and the means by which he sustains the fantasy. If he killed his family driving drunk, he might keep drinking inside his fantasy world as a slow form of suicide, or as a way to maintain the mental state that allows the fantasy to persist. He cannot sober up, because sobering up might mean facing reality. The Drunken Clam, where Peter passes time with his friends, becomes his refuge from even his own fantasy. When the fantasy grows too painful, Peter retreats into literal drunkenness within the fantasy itself. Certain episodes gesture more directly at the darkness beneath the comedy. In one storyline, Peter learns he is mentally disabled due to a genetic condition, a revelation later undone by surgery, but one that raises questions about his mental state and whether he can perceive reality accurately. In another, Peter suffers a stroke and temporarily loses his ability to function, exposing a vulnerability and fear that rarely surface. These moments crack the comedy open to reveal a damaged person underneath. If the entire show lives in Peter's mind, such episodes are his awareness straining to break through his delusions. His fantasy occasionally cannot hold, and the truth of his mental state flickers into view before he buries it again. The show's approach to continuity matters here too. Family Guy sometimes references earlier episodes and maintains running gags, but it also discards its own history whenever convenient. Characters forget major events, relationships reset with no explanation, and the show contradicts itself constantly. That selective memory mirrors how a traumatized mind operates. Peter remembers what he wants to remember and forgets whatever threatens the fantasy. The inconsistency is not a flaw in the writing, but a symptom of how a damaged consciousness works, real memories blurring into invented ones until nothing can be told apart. Viewed through this lens, every joke takes on a darker cast. When Peter battles a giant chicken across multiple episodes in elaborate action sequences, it becomes his mind trying to process rage and violence through absurdist distance. When the family travels through time or visits parallel universes, Peter's consciousness is exploring what his life might have been had he chosen differently. When characters address the camera or comment on the show's structure, Peter's awareness of his fantasy's artificiality briefly rises to the surface before being smothered again. Every episode becomes a coping mechanism, a story Peter tells himself to dodge an unbearable truth. The theory imagines Peter sitting somewhere, maybe in a psychiatric facility, maybe still at the scene of the crash, running these scenarios in his head, while his real body remains trapped in the aftermath of what he did. Everything we watch is his desperate attempt to keep his family alive in the only way left to him, through imagination and delusion. The comedy exists as a defense mechanism, converting tragedy into farce, because farce can be survived while tragedy cannot. Peter laughs because if he stopped, he would have to scream. This reading does not demand that every fan accept it as the definitive explanation. The show works perfectly well as straightforward comedy with no hidden depths. Yet the theory endures because the evidence sits right there in the canon, and once you see the pattern, it becomes hard to unsee. Intentionally or not, Family Guy contains within itself the story of a man who destroyed everything he loved and then built a fantasy world where destruction never matters, where death can be undone, and where he gets infinite chances to be with his family despite deserving none. In Peter's mind, the show goes on forever, because stopping would mean facing what he did, and that remains impossible. Before we move on, be sure to subscribe if you are enjoying this breakdown. That brings us to the second Peter Griffin theory, the one arguing that Peter is already dead or trapped in some kind of purgatory. Another idea that haunts Family Guy discussions holds that Peter has been dead for years. In this interpretation, he died during one of his countless near-death experiences early in the series, and everything that followed takes place in a purgatory tailored to his personality and his sins. Quahog is not a real Rhode Island town at all, but a liminal space where Peter cycles through endless moral tests, forever failing and forever being handed another chance. The theory points to the show's chaos, its refusal to obey normal logic, and its cyclical shape as evidence of a reality existing outside ordinary time and space. When you examine the episodes and how the show actually functions, the case for Peter dwelling in some form of afterlife becomes genuinely compelling. The theory first has to pin down when Peter died. Several early season episodes feature moments where he should have died, yet somehow survived. In one, he fights a giant chicken named Ernie in a marathon battle that levels much of Quahog. They plummet from staggering heights, smash through buildings, and inflict wounds that would kill a human many times over. And Peter strolls away, bruised but breathing. In another early episode, he slips into a coma after a stroke and undergoes what plays like an out-of-body experience. He wakes at the end, but the theory proposes he never truly woke in reality. That coma marked his crossing from life into purgatory, and everything afterward exists in this in-between state. The show never confirms a full recovery, because there was no recovery. His consciousness simply carried on in a different realm, while his real body died. Purgatory, in religious tradition, is where souls work through their sins before moving on to heaven or hell, placed in situations meant to teach lessons and force recognition of moral failure. Peter cycles through hundreds of episodes committing sins, hurting people, facing consequences, and then resetting without having learned a thing. Each episode hands him a chance to be better, and each one ends with him failing, or succeeding only briefly, before the next begins with him right back at square one. That pattern mirrors exactly how purgatory is supposed to operate. Peter is tested over and over, offered chances to grow and change, but he cannot escape because he fundamentally refuses to learn. The purgatory of Quahog is built specifically for him, stocked with temptations and trials that expose his worst qualities again and again. Death in Family Guy happens constantly, without making any sense by normal rules. Characters die and return with no explanation. Brian dies and comes back through time travel. Peter himself has died in various episodes and always returns. In one, he literally goes to heaven, meets God, and is sent back to Earth. The show treats it as a temporary visit, but within the purgatory framework, the encounter reads differently. Peter was already dead when he reached heaven, and God returned him to purgatory because his trials were not finished. The show's casual relationship with death implies that everyone in Quahog exists in a space where death has already occurred, and what follows is merely a different mode of existence. The other residents of Quahog function as elements of Peter's purgatory rather than independent people. Lois is his moral anchor, the person representing what he should cherish and protect. She forgives him endlessly because purgatory grants Peter infinite opportunities to get things right with her. Every time he betrays her, wounds her, or takes her for granted, he fails a test. Every time he shows her genuine love or makes a real sacrifice, he passes a small one. But the tests never end because Peter never fundamentally changes. Lois is at once his reward and his trial, the person he could keep if only he became worthy, held perpetually just out of reach because he keeps failing. Brian works as Peter's conscience and guide through purgatory. In many depictions of the afterlife, souls travel with guides who help them navigate their trials. Brian is intelligent, educated, and often tries to steer Peter toward better choices, yet he also shares many of Peter's flaws, especially the alcoholism and self-destruction, which makes him a flawed guide. That imperfection fits, because Peter's guide would reflect his own damaged moral compass. Brian cannot save Peter because Brian is compromised himself, perhaps another soul working through his own purgatory alongside him. Their friendship is two broken souls trying to help each other while neither is capable of real change. When Brian temporarily dies, it rocks Peter's entire world, because losing his guide means losing the one voice that occasionally pulls him toward redemption. Stewie takes on a more supernatural role in this reading. A baby who builds time machines, produces clones, and commands godlike technology does not belong in ordinary reality. In purgatory, Stewie could be a demon or trickster whose purpose is to tempt Peter and sow chaos, and his schemes routinely put the family in danger so that peace never lasts in the Griffin house. Alternatively, he could be an angel or a neutral force testing Peter through absurd challenges. His mastery of time makes sense if time does not run normally in purgatory. Stewie can reset events, spawn alternate timelines, and undo deaths because the realm Peter inhabits is not bound by linear time. Every loop and reset Stewie triggers serves purgatory's aim of giving Peter another chance to learn. Meg's role grows even darker here. Peter treats her with cruelty and rejection while she soaks up abuse from everyone. In purgatory, Meg might embody Peter's greatest failure, perhaps a daughter he neglected or wounded in life. She exists in his purgatory as a constant reminder of how badly he failed as a father. His guilt prevents him from loving her properly, so he holds her at bay through mockery. Her suffering is both Peter's punishment and his test. If he could show her real love and recognize her worth, he might pass an important trial, but he never does. The family even states in one episode that Meg's role is to absorb abuse so everyone else stays stable, which sounds exactly like a purgatory mechanism in which one soul suffers to hold the system together. Chris mirrors Peter but younger, standing in for who Peter was before his worst mistakes. Chris has time to become someone better, yet he keeps following Peter's example, suggesting that even in purgatory, Peter cannot stop corrupting the people around him. Chris should be Peter's shot at redemption through guiding his son well, but instead, Peter teaches him his worst habits. That repeated failure is another test Peter cannot pass. Quahog itself runs on rules that make no sense in normal reality. The town endures apocalyptic events regularly, and yet everything always returns to normal. Buildings explode and rebuild overnight. The town has been destroyed by disaster after disaster and somehow stands intact by the next episode. Its geography shifts to suit whatever the plot demands, with locations appearing and vanishing without explanation. Those impossibilities make perfect sense if Quahog is not a real place, but a constructed environment that reshapes itself to serve Purgatory's needs. The town provides whatever settings and situations will test Peter most effectively. When he needs to face consequences, disaster strikes Quahog. When the trial ends, everything resets, because Purgatory does not accumulate lasting damage. The citizens of Quahog exist as extras in Peter's Purgatory, materializing when a situation requires them. Mayor Adam West, who governed the town for most of the series, behaved in wildly insane ways no real politician could survive, which fits if he is not a real person, but a manifestation of Purgatory's chaos, present to create the absurd situations that force Peter into moral choices. Recurring figures like Herbert the Old Man or Consuela the Maid surface episodically to serve specific functions in Peter's trials, then fade back until they are needed again. They have no lives outside their interactions with Peter, because they are pieces of his purgatory rather than independent souls. Peter's friends Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland embody different aspects of his personality and different types of souls in purgatory. Joe is permanently paralyzed, yet keeps his optimism and remains a decent man despite his suffering, representing who Peter could become if he accepted his limitations and focused on being good in spite of his flaws. Joe's paralysis may be his own purgatory trial, but he bears it with grace, modeling the behavior Peter ignores. Quagmire embodies pure, unrestrained sin, committing acts of depravity constantly with minimal consequence, a portrait of how sin becomes normalized when practiced openly enough. He is Peter's dark mirror, showing what happens when someone fully surrenders to their worst impulses. Cleveland seems the most ordinary of the three, standing for everyday decency, yet even he gets dragged into Peter's chaos again and again. Together, the three form a spectrum from virtue to vice, with Peter suspended in the middle, pulled both ways without committing fully to either path. The series has repeatedly broken reality entirely or introduced religious and supernatural elements head-on. Peter has met God, Jesus, and death as literal characters who interact with him. God appears as a real entity who acknowledges Peter's existence and makes decisions about his fate. Death becomes Peter's friend across multiple episodes, a physical being who can be beaten or manipulated. These encounters are staged for comedy, but they confirm that the supernatural operates openly in Quahog. In normal reality, people do not meet death and play games with him. In purgatory, where the boundary between life and death has dissolved, such meetings become possible. Peter's casual dealings with cosmic entities suggest he exists in a realm where the divine and the mortal intersect constantly. One especially telling episode has Peter die and go to heaven, where he meets historical figures and departed relatives, receives judgment, and is eventually returned to Earth to keep living. The show frames it as a temporary visit, but in the purgatory theory, Peter glimpsing heaven makes sense because he is already dead. Heaven is something he can see, but cannot yet enter, because he has not completed his trials. God sends him back not to life, but to continued purgatory. Peter's confusion about being alive reflects that he does not fully grasp his own state, thinking he is living because purgatory convinces souls they still are, so they can properly experience their trials. The cyclical nature of every episode supports the reading perfectly. Peter begins each one in essentially the same condition as when the series started: the same job, the same family, the same friends, the same personality. Despite thousands of adventures and consequences, he never fundamentally changes. He learns lessons within an episode and forgets them by the next. That eternal return to the starting point mirrors purgatory's function of repeating trials until the soul finally grows. Peter cannot progress because he refuses to change, so purgatory keeps resetting him to try again. The fact that the show has run more than 20 years with the characters not aging at all suggests time works differently in their realm. They are frozen in an eternal cycle because they exist outside normal time. The violence Peter endures and inflicts should have killed him or imprisoned him countless times. He has committed manslaughter, destroyed millions in property, assaulted people, and endangered his family repeatedly. In reality, he would be dead or in prison. In purgatory, consequences manifest differently. Peter can experience violence and punishment without permanent death because he already died. Legal and moral consequences behave differently because the realm exists to test souls rather than enforce earthly justice. Peter faces fallout within episodes, but never builds a permanent record because each reset wipes the slate clean for the next trial. That makes no sense in reality, but perfect sense in purgatory, where the same soul receives infinite chances. Some episodes reference hell, damnation, and eternal punishment directly. In one storyline, Peter worries about going to hell and tries to become better, and of course, he fails and reverts. The show treats his fear as a passing concern, but that fear fits if Peter exists in purgatory and knows on some level that hell remains a genuine possibility. He is being tested to determine his final destination, and his failures keep nudging him toward damnation, while his occasional good acts hold him in the balance. The writers may not intend this, but they have planted enough references to the afterlife and divine judgment for the pieces to lock together. The extended flashback and alternate reality episodes take on new meaning in Purgatory. When the show depicts Peter's life before the main series, or shows alternate versions of events, these could be Purgatory, presenting him with the different paths his life might have taken, so he sees other versions of himself, making other choices as part of his moral education. Purgatory uses these visions to help him understand where he went wrong and what he could have been. The fact that these alternate realities feel as solid as the main timeline suggests all timelines exist equally in this space outside normal causality. Alcohol sits at the center of Peter's purgatory. He drinks constantly, and drinking drives many of his worst decisions. If his death in reality was alcohol-related, his purgatory would naturally revolve around continued temptation by alcohol. Each time he drinks to excess, he fails a test. Each time he chooses drink over his family, he proves he has not learned. But the alcohol is always waiting at the drunken clam, always offered by his friends, always framed as a normal part of life. Purgatory tempts him with the very substance that destroyed him, testing whether he can resist or moderate, and he never does, so the cycle continues. The drunken clam itself might be a kind of way station within Purgatory, where souls gather between trials, which would explain why the men spend so much time there doing nothing but talking and drinking. The show occasionally breaks the fourth wall, with characters acknowledging they are in a television program or speaking to the audience. Those moments crack the illusion and imply the characters have some awareness of their artificial existence. In Purgatory, souls might experience flashes of lucidity in which they recognize they are not truly alive. Peter's fourth wall breaks are his consciousness briefly grasping his real situation before Purgatory reasserts its grip. The show-within-a-show quality of Family Guy mirrors how Purgatory might function as a constructed reality that now and then reveals its own construction. Physical spaces behave impossibly. The Griffin House is bigger inside than makes any architectural sense, with rooms appearing and disappearing as needed, and it has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times without explanation. Those spatial impossibilities suggest the house, like Quahog itself, is not a real structure, but a manifestation of Peter's purgatory, providing whatever space the story requires because it serves the trials rather than obeying architecture. Likewise, Peter's job at the brewery follows no real corporate logic and hands him endless chances to cause disasters without being fired, existing to test his responsibility and work ethic rather than to function as a real business. Time in Family Guy has been shown explicitly to work strangely. Stewie has time machines, characters travel to past and future, and events unfold out of sequence with no explanation, and the show has openly lampshaded its own timeline inconsistencies. That temporal chaos fits perfectly if the show takes place outside normal time. Purgatory sits between life and death, potentially outside linear time entirely, so past, present, and future might coexist in this realm, allowing the confusion the show displays. Peter experiences time as a loop because that is how Purgatory functions for him. The strangest episodes, the ones with talking animals, supernatural beings, and total breaks from reality, support the theory rather than contradicting it. In a realm designed to test souls, anything can happen because the rules of reality do not apply. When Peter fights a giant chicken across city-leveling battles, Purgatory is testing his capacity for sustained violence and revenge. When the family meets aliens, ghosts, or magical beings, Purgatory is introducing supernatural trials. Everything impossible in reality becomes possible in an afterlife realm whose only limits are whatever serves the purpose of testing and teaching souls. Peter's utter lack of growth over hundreds of episodes is the strongest evidence of all. Real people change over time through experience and consequence, and Peter experiences more extreme consequences than most people face in a lifetime, yet he stays fundamentally the same. He has lost jobs, friends, respect, and nearly lost his family dozens of times, and still he never truly learns. That makes no sense for a living person, but perfect sense for a soul in purgatory who has not yet earned release. Peter cannot move forward until he changes, but he cannot change because of his core flaws, so he remains trapped. The show continues indefinitely because his purgatory continues indefinitely, cycling him through trials until he finally grows, and since that may never happen, the show can theoretically run forever. The comedy itself works as a coping mechanism within purgatory. Peter turns his suffering into jokes because directly confronting his damnation would be unbearable, and the humor keeps both viewers and Peter at a distance from the darkness underneath. Every joke about death, violence, or moral failure is Peter's soul trying to process its situation through laughter instead of screaming. Purgatory might even generate the humor as a mercy, letting souls endure their trials through comic framing rather than pure torment. The laughter makes the punishment bearable enough to continue, but it does not lessen the punishment itself. Whether or not the creators intended any of this, the canonical evidence is spread across hundreds of episodes. Family Guy has shown Peter die and return, interact with divine beings, live through impossible events, and cycle through endless moral failures without growth. It has established that death is temporary, reality is flexible, and consequences do not accumulate in the usual way. All of it aligns with Peter existing in purgatory after an early death, trapped in Quahog, cycling through episodes, making the same mistakes, being handed endless chances at redemption, and failing every time. The show goes on because the purgatory goes on, and Peter cannot leave until he becomes someone worthy of leaving, which he may never manage. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe if this breakdown is holding your attention. Next, we come to the idea that Lois Griffin is the real villain, the family's true abuser. A darker reading of the show suggests Lois is not the long-suffering wife holding everyone together, but the primary source of dysfunction and abuse in the household. This interpretation reframes the whole series by casting Lois as a manipulative, controlling figure who has systematically dismantled Peter's personality over years of emotional cruelty. Under this reading, Peter's stupidity and childish behavior are not natural traits, but coping mechanisms he developed in response to being controlled, belittled, and emotionally destroyed by his wife. Lois looks sympathetic because the show frames her as the reasonable adult managing an idiot husband. But when you study her actual conduct across hundreds of episodes, a pattern emerges of someone who uses cruelty, manipulation, and control to dominate everyone around her. The evidence sits throughout the series in moments played for laughs that reveal something far more disturbing about who Lois really is. The foundation of the theory is how Lois treats Peter in their everyday exchanges. She routinely calls him stupid, fat, and worthless. She mocks his intelligence in front of their children and friends. She waves away his feelings and opinions as irrelevant. When Peter is excited about something, Lois shuts him down with contempt. When he tries to pursue a hobby or interest, she ridicules him until he quits. The show frames all of this as a wife coping with an incompetent husband, but the pattern matches textbook emotional abuse. Lois systematically erodes Peter's self-worth through relentless criticism and mockery. She has convinced him, and everyone around them, that he is worthless, which gives her total control over the relationship. Peter genuinely believes he is lucky to have Lois, because she has spent years demolishing his confidence to the point where he cannot imagine anyone else tolerating him. Her control over the household reaches into every decision and every corner of family life. She manages the finances even though Peter works full-time at the brewery. She decides what the family does, where they go, and how they spend their time. She dictates Peter's behavior and punishes him when he disobeys. The show presents this as necessary because Peter makes terrible choices, but that framing ignores that Lois has engineered a situation in which Peter is not allowed to make any choices at all. She has infantilized him to the point where he behaves like a child because she treats him like one. When a person is constantly told they are incompetent and barred from exercising any autonomy, they eventually stop trying to be competent. Peter's stupidity may be a learned helplessness response to years of Lois controlling everything and punishing any bid for independence. The way Lois treats Meg exposes even darker corners of her character. Lois takes part in the family's abuse of Meg and sometimes leads it. She has called Meg ugly, stupid, and worthless to her face. She has forgotten her birthday and the important moments of her life. She has consistently prioritized her other children over Meg. One of the most disturbing dynamics is how Lois seems to view Meg as competition rather than as her daughter. In several episodes, Lois grows jealous when Meg draws male attention or starts to build confidence. She sabotages Meg's attempts at happiness and keeps her locked in low self-esteem. This suggests Lois needs to be the most attractive and desirable woman in the house and cannot tolerate her own daughter threatening that standing. A mother who sees her teenage daughter as a rival has serious psychological problems, and Lois displays this dynamic repeatedly across the series. Her background gives crucial context for the abuse. She comes from an extremely wealthy family, the Pewterschmidts, and married Peter against her father's wishes. The show frames this as romantic rebellion, but it also reveals that Lois surrendered a life of luxury and privilege to be with Peter. She could have married wealth and lived in mansions, yet instead, she lives in a middle-class house in Quahog with a family she plainly resents. That decision has left Lois bitter and angry. She takes her regret out on Peter by constantly reminding him of everything she gave up. She wields her sacrifice as a weapon to control him and to justify her cruelty. Peter can never do enough to compensate for the life Lois lost, so she punishes him endlessly for being the reason she ended up in what she sees as a lesser life. The show has revealed that Lois had a wild past before settling down. She dated wealthy men, partied hard, and lived a glamorous life. She was engaged to someone else before Peter, and that relationship ended badly. She also has a history with drugs, including cocaine, used the show references more than once. That past suggests Lois married Peter not out of love, but as an act of self-destruction or rebellion against her family. She chose the opposite of what her wealthy parents wanted, and she has been punishing Peter for being the instrument of that rebellion ever since. He represents everything she gave up and everything she believes she deserved better than, so he becomes the target of all her frustration about how her life turned out. Her affairs and sexual behavior throughout the series reveal a pattern of using infidelity as a tool of power. She has cheated on Peter multiple times across various episodes. She had an affair with Bill Clinton in one storyline. She kisses other men and flirts regularly. The show sometimes frames these moments as justified because Peter is such a poor husband, but that framing excuses abuse. Lois uses the threat of infidelity to keep Peter insecure and hungry for her approval. She flirts with other men in front of him to remind him she has options, and he does not. She makes him feel lucky she stays despite his flaws, which hands her enormous power in the relationship. Peter lives in constant fear of losing her, which makes him easier to control and manipulate. The dynamic between them includes frequent physical violence from Lois toward Peter. She hits him, throws things at him, and physically assaults him when angry. The show plays this for laughs because female-on-male violence is treated as less serious in media, but the behavior matches abuse patterns. Lois uses physical violence to enforce her control and to punish Peter when he disobeys or annoys her. Peter rarely fights back and usually accepts the violence as something he deserves. That acceptance shows he has been conditioned to believe Lois has the right to hurt him. Abusive relationships often involve the victim believing they deserve the abuse, and Peter demonstrates that belief constantly, apologizing to Lois even when he did nothing wrong and taking blame for problems she caused, because she has trained him to be responsible for her emotions. Lois's rage and capacity for extreme violence surface in multiple episodes where she completely loses control. In one storyline, she becomes a cage fighter and discovers she loves violence, beating people brutally and finding satisfaction in causing pain. The show reveals that Lois carries a deep anger she usually suppresses, and it emerges whenever she is given permission to be violent. Her rage is not about defending her family or protecting anyone. She simply enjoys hurting people. That revelation implies the emotional cruelty she inflicts on her family springs from the same place as her physical violence. She wants to hurt people and has found ways to do it within her family that society excuses or ignores. Another episode shows her teaching piano and becoming emotionally and verbally abusive toward her students, screaming at children, wrecking their confidence, and reducing them to tears. She justifies it as pushing them to improve, but she clearly relishes the power she holds over vulnerable kids. Her teaching style mirrors how she treats her own family. She believes cruelty is how you motivate people, or perhaps she simply enjoys being cruel and uses motivation as a cover. Either way, the episode confirms her abusive behavior extends to anyone she has power over. The show has depicted Lois with serious anger management problems that occasionally explode. She has committed crimes, including violence and theft, without showing remorse. In one storyline, she becomes addicted to shoplifting and continues even after being caught because she enjoys the thrill. That addiction to breaking rules and hurting others suggests antisocial tendencies that her role as wife and mother helps conceal. She is not a good person doing her best in a hard situation. She is someone who enjoys control, violence, and getting away with bad behavior, and her position as the responsible adult provides cover for these darker aspects of her personality. Lois keeps Peter in a state of dependency that prevents him from ever leaving or improving. She controls his access to money, friends, and activities. She monitors his behavior and punishes independence. Whenever Peter tries to better himself or chase his own interests, she finds ways to sabotage him, always claiming it is for his own good, yet the result is always Peter remaining dependent on her. Abusers often isolate and control their victims to prevent escape, and Lois has effectively cut Peter off from any life outside her control. He has friends, but Lois decides when he can see them. He has a job, but Lois controls the money he earns. He has interests, but Lois decides which ones he may pursue. That degree of control is not normal in a healthy relationship. The way Lois responds to Peter's romantic gestures reveals how she maintains dominance. When he plans something nice for her, she usually finds fault and makes him feel stupid for trying. She sets impossible standards he can never meet, which keeps him perpetually trying to please her and perpetually failing. This ensures Peter stays focused on earning her approval rather than questioning whether her treatment of him is acceptable. Abusers use a tactic of moving the goalposts, keeping victims off balance by changing expectations so success becomes impossible, and Lois employs it constantly. Peter can never be good enough, because Lois needs him to feel inadequate to preserve her power over him. Peter's childishness and apparent stupidity make far more sense as responses to abuse than as natural traits. People in abusive relationships often regress or develop learned helplessness, giving up on solving problems because every attempt meets punishment or failure. Peter acts like a child because Lois treats him like one. He makes stupid decisions because he has been told he is stupid so often that he believes it and has stopped thinking critically. He gravitates toward childish pastimes like television and toys because those are the only areas of life where Lois grants him any autonomy. His drinking likely began or worsened as a way to cope with emotional abuse at home. The more broken Peter becomes, the more justified Lois appears in controlling him, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which his dysfunction validates her abuse. The moments when Peter shows real intelligence or competence are revealing in this light. He occasionally displays skills, knowledge, or emotional insight that contradict his usual stupidity, running successful businesses in some episodes, solving complex problems, showing deep love for his children and friends. These flashes suggest Peter is not naturally stupid, but has been conditioned to act that way. When he escapes Lois's immediate influence, or when a situation is serious enough to break through his learned helplessness, his real personality surfaces. He is capable of more than Lois permits, and she suppresses his potential because a competent Peter might leave her or challenge her control. Other characters sometimes notice Lois has serious issues, though those observations get dismissed or ignored. Brian has pointed out that she is controlling and manipulative. Quagmire has expressed, in several episodes, that he sees through her act and thinks she is cruel to Peter. Even Peter's father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt, treats Peter badly, in part echoing how Lois treats her husband. The show frames these observations as jokes or misunderstandings, but they acknowledge that people around the Griffins sense something wrong with how Lois behaves. The fact that these concerns never lead to consequences mirrors how real abuse often goes unaddressed, because the abuser has convinced everyone that the victim deserves the treatment. Lois's relationship with Brian is telling, because she treats him better than she treats Peter in many ways. She holds intelligent conversations with Brian, respects his opinions, and shows him affection without constant criticism. That difference proves she is capable of treating people well when she chooses to, and she specifically chooses not to treat Peter well. The respect she extends to Brian against the contempt she aims at Peter shows his treatment is deliberate rather than reactive. Lois could be kind to Peter, but she selects cruelty because it serves her purposes better. The show has revealed that Lois harbors a specific fantasy of an ideal life that does not include the family she actually has. In episodes where she imagines alternate realities or voices her true desires, she often pictures herself with different children, a different husband, or no family at all. She dreams of being a musician or artist, living a glamorous, responsibility-free life. Those fantasies suggest she deeply resents her real family and sees them as obstacles to the life she wanted. That resentment drives her abuse. She punishes Peter and the children for existing and for keeping her from her fantasy. They are anchors holding her down, and she makes sure they know it through her cruelty. Meg's role as the family's designated target serves Lois's needs perfectly by encouraging everyone to mistreat her. Lois creates a lightning rod that absorbs the family's dysfunction and keeps it from being aimed at her. Meg takes the blame and abuse that might otherwise fall on Lois for being a poor mother and wife. The show even had Meg openly state that she accepts abuse to keep the family stable, framing her suffering as necessary, which benefits Lois enormously. As long as Meg exists as the scapegoat, Lois can abuse Peter without being seen as the problem. The family needs someone to blame and hurt, and Lois has ensured that person is Meg rather than herself. Her sexual control over Peter is another instrument of abuse. She withholds sex as punishment and grants it as reward, using intimacy to manipulate his behavior, and she has explicitly said she uses sex to control him in several episodes. She also exploits his desires to humiliate him, making him beg or degrade himself for her attention. That manipulation keeps Peter desperate and willing to endure mistreatment in exchange for occasional affection. Lois understands that Peter's desire for her gives her power, and she exploits it without guilt. The show occasionally shows Lois having a mental health crisis or breakdown, which the narrative frames as proof she is stressed and struggling. But those breakdowns can also be read as moments when the effort of sustaining her controlling behavior becomes too much. Abusers often experience stress from managing their abuse and controlling their victim. When Lois breaks down, she may not be collapsing under Peter's incompetence, but exhausted from maintaining her dominance and managing the family dynamics she engineered. Her breakdowns generate sympathy and reinforce the idea that she is a victim of her family's dysfunction rather than its architect. Peter's drinking takes on new meaning when read as a response to abuse. He spends hours at the Drunken Clam, which looks like irresponsibility and neglect, but also represents his only escape from Lois's control. The bar is the one place he can exist without her supervision and criticism, and his drinking likely numbs the pain of living in an abusive marriage. Many people in abusive relationships turn to substances to cope, and Peter fits the pattern perfectly. Lois complains about his drinking, yet also benefits from it, since an intoxicated Peter is easier to control and more likely to make mistakes she can use against him. The cyclical shape of their relationship matches the cycle of abuse. Peter does something Lois disapproves of. She punishes him through criticism, violence, or withheld affection. He apologizes and tries to make it up to her. She eventually forgives him, and there is a brief peace before the cycle starts again. This repeats episode after episode. Abusive relationships follow similar cycles, with tension building, abuse occurring, the abuser apologizing or the victim placating them, a honeymoon period, and then tension building again. Peter and Lois never break the cycle, because breaking it would require Lois to stop being abusive, and she has no reason to stop while the abuse serves her needs. The show has depicted alternate universe versions of the Griffins in which Peter and Lois have different dynamics, and those versions often show Peter is more competent when he is not married to Lois. In timelines where they never married, or where Lois is absent, Peter sometimes functions better and makes smarter decisions. That suggests his dysfunction is tied specifically to his relationship with Lois rather than being his inherent nature. Remove Lois from the equation and Peter improves, which supports the idea that she is the source of his problems rather than the solution to them. Her need for control extends beyond Peter to the whole family. She decides what the children can do, who they see, and how they behave, monitoring and controlling every aspect of family life with an iron grip disguised as responsible parenting. Chris and Stewie show signs of being emotionally damaged by her treatment. Chris has developed strange behaviors and seems emotionally stunted. Stewie carries a murderous rage aimed primarily at Lois, which a Freudian reading would interpret as the child recognizing the mother as a threat. Even as a baby, Stewie somehow senses that Lois is dangerous, and his plots to kill her represent a subconscious recognition of her abusive nature. The way the show frames Lois as sympathetic and reasonable, while casting Peter as the problem, reflects how society often fails to recognize female abusers. Cultural narratives assume women are nurturing and men are aggressive, so when a woman abuses a man emotionally or physically, observers excuse or minimize it. Lois benefits from those assumptions. She appears to be the responsible adult managing a chaotic household, and everyone accepts that framing without examining her behavior critically. The show is built on the premise that Peter is the problem and Lois is the solution, but studying their actual interactions reveals the opposite. Peter is broken by someone who has spent years systematically destroying his self-worth and autonomy. In this interpretation, every episode is an abusive relationship in which the victim has been so thoroughly broken that he appears to be the source of dysfunction rather than its target. Lois holds her position as the real villain by hiding behind societal expectations about gender roles and family dynamics, and the show continues because abusive relationships often continue for years or lifetimes. Peter cannot leave because Lois has destroyed his ability to imagine life without her. The tragedy of this reading is watching a man so completely controlled and broken that he has forgotten he ever had the option to be anything else. Before we go further, Please subscribe if you are finding this breakdown worthwhile. That leads into the theory that Lois will eventually leave Peter for good. One of the most debated ideas about the show's future argues that Family Guy is building toward an inevitable ending in which Lois finally walks away permanently. In this reading, the writers have been planting seeds across hundreds of episodes that demonstrate the Griffin marriage cannot sustain itself forever. Each season nudges the relationship closer to a breaking point, and eventually that breaking point will arrive in a way even Family Guy's reset button cannot undo. Every fight, every betrayal, every bout of chaos Peter causes adds weight that will one day crush the marriage. When you trace the pattern of their relationship over more than 20 years, the evidence suggests Lois's departure is not a matter of if, but when. The theory begins with how their relationship has evolved. In the early seasons, their conflicts were relatively minor and always resolved by the episode's end. Peter did something dumb, Lois got angry, they talked it out, and love won. But as the show progressed, the severity of Peter's actions escalated dramatically. He is no longer merely forgetting anniversaries or making small mistakes. He has endangered Lois's life, crushed her dreams, humiliated her publicly in ever more extreme ways, and committed acts that would instantly end any real marriage. The show has raised the stakes of his failures season after season, and there is only so far this can escalate before something breaks permanently. Several episodes have already featured Peter and Lois separating or nearly divorcing, and each instance pushes them closer to a point of no return. In one storyline, they separate after a major fight, and both start dating other people. Lois experiences what life without Peter could be, and seems genuinely happier during the separation, enjoying the freedom, the absence of chaos, and the ability to make decisions without Peter's interference. They reconcile in the end, but the episode plants the seed that Lois has glimpsed an alternative life and found it appealing. Once someone in an unhappy marriage realizes they could be happy alone or with someone else, that knowledge never fully fades. Lois now knows what leaving feels like, and every later conflict makes that option more tempting. Another episode had Lois in an affair, or near affair, that the show presented as understandable given how Peter treats her. Although they stayed together, the episode acknowledged that Lois has legitimate reasons to want out, giving her a sympathetic portrait as someone trapped with a man who takes her for granted and makes her life harder. That framing matters, because it establishes that the audience would understand and possibly support Lois leaving. The writers are preparing viewers to accept that she deserves better than Peter, setting up a future storyline in which she finally acts on that realization. The pattern of reconciliation after every fight has grown increasingly forced and hollow. In early seasons, Peter and Lois shared genuine emotional moments where they remembered why they loved each other. In recent seasons, the reconciliations feel perfunctory and unearned. Peter apologizes with a grand gesture that fixes nothing about his behavior. Lois accepts because the episode needs to end, and they snap back to the status quo without addressing any real issue. That pattern cannot continue forever, because it rings more false each time. The show itself seems aware these reconciliations are unsustainable, and eventually, the narrative will have to reflect that by having Lois refuse to reconcile. Lois's development across the series shows her growing more independent, more aware of her own needs, and less willing to sacrifice herself. Early Lois was more traditionally submissive and patient. Modern Lois has career ambitions, stands up for herself more forcefully, and regularly voices frustration with her life. The show has developed her into someone who knows she deserves better, but has not yet found the strength to leave. That arc logically concludes with her finally choosing herself over the marriage. Character growth demands change, and Lois's growth has pointed toward autonomy and self-respect, whose natural endpoint is leaving a relationship that diminishes her. Peter, meanwhile, has shown no capacity for genuine change across the entire series, which is central to why divorce becomes inevitable. If Peter could learn and grow, the marriage might survive, but hundreds of episodes have proven he cannot or will not change his fundamental behavior. He makes the same mistakes, apologizes, and immediately does something equally destructive. Lois has given him infinite chances, and he has wasted every one. At some point, even the most patient person runs out of chances, and the show has established that Peter will never become the husband Lois needs, which means staying married means accepting permanent unhappiness. Eventually, Lois will recognize that leaving is the only path to a different life. The show has given Lois multiple episodes in which she imagines life without Peter, or explicitly states she regrets marrying him. These moments play for comedy, but expose her real feelings. She has said aloud that she gave up a better life to be with Peter, and that she questions whether the sacrifice was worth it. She has fantasized about being with other men or living alone. She has said Peter holds her back from her goals. When someone repeatedly voices regret about their marriage, they are usually working up the nerve to end it. The show keeps handing Lois chances to express dissatisfaction, planting the idea in the audience's mind that she might eventually act on those feelings. Peter's chaos has escalated to levels that threaten the family's safety, finances, and future. He has bankrupted them multiple times, put the children in mortal danger, made enemies who threatened the family with violence, and destroyed their home, their possessions, and Lois's sense of security. In real life, any one of these could trigger divorce, but Peter commits them regularly, and the accumulating damage cannot be waved away forever. At some point, Lois will realize that staying means accepting that her children will never be safe, her finances will never be stable, and her life will never have peace, and maternal instinct and self-preservation will override whatever love remains. The show has depicted Lois having serious conversations with friends, family, or therapists about her marriage, and those conversations increasingly acknowledge that her situation is not normal or acceptable. Others tell her she deserves better, validate her frustration and exhaustion, and subtly or openly suggest she should leave. The show is surrounding Lois with voices that support divorce, building a permission structure for her to eventually take that step. If everyone around her agrees leaving would be reasonable, she will find it easier to actually leave when the final straw arrives. Certain episodes have shown what Lois's post-divorce life could look like, and those depictions are notably positive. In alternate timelines or fantasy sequences, divorced Lois is often happier, healthier, and more fulfilled than married Lois. She pursues her music career, dates interesting men, and enjoys freedom and peace. The show has offered glimpses of a life after Peter that looks appealing rather than tragic, which suggests the writers are preparing the audience to see divorce not as a sad ending, but as a positive new beginning. When it happens, viewers will already have been shown that Lois will be fine and probably better off. The children's ages support the timeline. Meg is already a teenager, and Chris is approaching adulthood. Stewie remains a baby, but in narrative terms, the children are old enough that divorce becomes more feasible, and Lois no longer needs to stay for their sake as much as she might have when they were younger. Meg and Chris can handle their parents separating, and Stewie is too young to remember them being together anyway. The practical obstacles to divorce shrink as the children grow, leaving Lois fewer reasons to remain in an unhappy marriage for their benefit. Peter has crossed lines in recent seasons that feel like they should be unforgivable. He has publicly humiliated Lois in ways that damaged her reputation and relationships, betrayed her trust in fundamental ways, and shown shocking selfishness and disregard for her well-being. The show keeps raising the bar on how badly Peter can behave, and each new extreme should logically be the thing that finally ends the marriage. Lois cannot keep forgiving these escalating offenses indefinitely without straining credibility, and eventually the writers will have to acknowledge that some actions cannot be forgiven, with Peter crossing that final line. The show's willingness to make permanent changes in recent years suggests divorce is not off the table. Brian died and stayed dead for several episodes before returning. Characters have been written out or significantly altered. The show has demonstrated it can commit to major shifts rather than always reverting to the exact same status quo, which makes a permanent divorce more plausible than it would have been in earlier seasons when nothing ever changed. Family Guy has matured to the point where it might be willing to fundamentally alter its premise by ending the marriage. Lois has built relationships and friendships outside of Peter that give her emotional support and alternative perspectives. She has friends unconnected to Peter, activities she does alone, and an identity separate from being his wife. That independence matters, because people in isolated relationships with no life outside their partner find it much harder to leave. Lois has a support network and a separate identity that would let her survive and thrive after divorce, so the groundwork for her life after Peter already exists, which makes the actual leaving more feasible. The show has featured episodes where the couple attends marriage counseling, and those sessions reveal fundamental incompatibilities that counseling cannot fix. The therapist sometimes looks horrified by what Peter has done or suggests the marriage has serious problems, framing the relationship as broken rather than merely strained. In fiction, counseling often serves as a precursor to divorce because it lets characters officially acknowledge the relationship is failing despite efforts to save it. Once counseling has been tried and failed, divorce becomes the logical next step. Peter's friendships at the Drunken Clam have increasingly become his primary emotional relationships, suggesting he is already partly checked out of his marriage. He spends more time with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland than with his wife, shares his thoughts and feelings with his friends rather than with Lois, and seems happier at the bar than at home. That emotional distance implies both Peter and Lois have been slowly separating even while remaining legally married. They already live somewhat separate lives within the same house, so the emotional divorce has been happening gradually across seasons, and a legal divorce would simply formalize what has already occurred. Lois's parents, especially her father Carter Pewterschmidt, have always disapproved of Peter and repeatedly offered Lois ways out of the marriage. Carter has enough money to support Lois through a divorce and provide financial security, and he would celebrate her leaving and probably help with lawyers and resources. Having family support for divorce, particularly from a wealthy and powerful father, removes one of the major obstacles people face when considering leaving. Lois knows she has somewhere to go and someone who will help, which makes leaving less frightening. The show has paralleled the Griffin marriage with other failing marriages in their social circle. Couples around them have divorced or clearly have miserable relationships, inviting Lois and the audience to wonder why the Griffin marriage persists when similar ones have already ended. Watching other couples divorce normalizes the idea and shows that life continues afterward. The show is creating a context in which divorce is common and survivable, making the eventual Griffin divorce less shocking and more inevitable. Recent episodes have shown Lois experiencing moments of clarity about how dysfunctional her life has become. She has breakdowns in which she admits she is unhappy, exhausted, and trapped, and she has said she feels she wasted her life on Peter. Such self-awareness is crucial because people cannot leave unhealthy situations until they fully acknowledge how unhealthy they are. Lois is reaching that point of clear-eyed understanding, and once it fully crystallizes, action will follow. The show's tone has gradually shifted to acknowledge darker truths about the family rather than playing everything for laughs. Earlier seasons treated Peter's stupidity as harmless fun, while recent seasons show real consequences and real damage. The writers are willing to explore the painful realities of this family's dysfunction, which suggests they might be willing to take the ultimate step of showing the marriage end. That tonal shift towards serious consequences supports the theory, because the show is no longer afraid to admit that actions have permanent effects. Lois has aged psychologically even though she has not aged physically. She shows signs of exhaustion, burnout, and emotional damage accumulated over years with Peter, seeming tired in a way that suggests she is running out of the energy required to hold the marriage together. People stay in difficult relationships only as long as they have the emotional resources to cope, and those resources are not infinite. Lois appears to be approaching empty, and when she reaches it, she will no longer have the strength to keep forgiving and forgetting. Exhaustion will make the decision for her. The narrative has established that Peter would survive divorce and might even benefit from it. He has friends, a job, and enough external support that he would not completely fall apart without Lois. The show has been careful not to make Lois so essential to Peter's basic functioning that leaving him would be like abandoning a helpless child. Peter is incompetent but not incapable, which suggests the writers want the audience to feel okay about Lois leaving, because Peter will be fine. He will be sad and he will struggle, but he will survive, and that removes the guilt factor that might otherwise cast Lois as a villain for abandoning her husband. Certain recent episodes feel like tests of how the audience would react to a separated or divorced Griffin family. Storylines where they live apart temporarily, or where the family dynamic shifts significantly, seem designed to gauge whether viewers would accept a permanent change. If the creators are seriously considering divorce, they would want to experiment with it in temporary ways first to see whether it breaks the show or whether the show works fine with the change. Those experimental episodes suggest the writers are at least exploring the idea in earnest. The theory predicts that the actual divorce will be triggered by a single catastrophic event rather than gradual decline. Peter will do something so egregious, so unforgivable, so destructive that even his staunchest defenders will admit Lois has no choice but to leave. That event will need to be bigger than anything Peter has done before, because it has to justify breaking a pattern of forgiveness that has defined hundreds of episodes. Perhaps he endangers the children in a way that cannot be dismissed, or destroys something truly irreplaceable to Lois, or commits a betrayal she cannot rationalize away. Whatever the trigger, it will have to be significant enough that the audience understands this time is different from all the others. After the divorce, the show could continue with a new dynamic. Peter could get visitation with the kids, Lois could explore life as a single mother, and the family would still interact, just in a different configuration. The premise does not require Peter and Lois to be married, only that the Griffin family exist in some form. Divorce would provide fresh storylines, new conflicts, and character development that the current setup has exhausted. Creatively, the marriage has been strip-mined for material for more than 2 decades, and ending it would revitalize the show by forcing new situations and dynamics. The theory also suggests that if divorce happens, it will ultimately be framed as the right decision for both Peter and Lois, presented not as a tragedy, but as necessary growth. Lois will be happier and freer. Peter will be forced to grow up and become more independent, and the children will adjust and possibly benefit from reduced chaos in their lives. The narrative will validate that staying together for the wrong reasons is worse than separating for the right ones, which would let the show handle divorce in a way that feels positive rather than depressing, while delivering a surprisingly mature message about relationships. Across hundreds of episodes, the pattern is clear. The marriage has been deteriorating slowly but surely, each season bringing new lows and new reasons to leave, Lois growing stronger while Peter stays stagnant. The question is not whether Lois will leave, but when, and what final unforgivable act will be the catalyst. The marriage is on borrowed time, and both the characters and the show itself seem to know it. Take a second to subscribe before we head into the next one. Next up is Brian Griffin, and the theory that he was once a human, remade through a CIA brain swap. One of the most disturbing ideas about Brian holds that he was not born a talking dog, but created through government experimentation that transplanted a human brain into a dog's body. In this widely discussed reading, Brian's exceptional intelligence, human-level consciousness, and ability to function in human society are not natural traits, but the product of CIA mind transfer experiments of the sort referenced throughout the Family Guy and American Dad universes. Brian retains memories, personality, and consciousness from a former human life while being trapped in a dog's body, which explains his constant existential crisis, his desperate need for validation, and his fraught relationship with his own identity. Trace the hints dropped about his mysterious origins across both shows, and the theory finds substantial support in moments that reveal something profoundly wrong about what Brian actually is. The foundation of the theory is the undeniable fact that Brian is nothing like other dogs in this universe. Most animals in the show behave like normal animals. They do not talk, walk upright, or possess human intelligence. Yet Brian speaks fluent English, writes novels, attends college, drives cars, drinks martinis, and pursues romantic relationships with human women. The show never explains why he has these abilities when no other dog does. He is not presented as an evolutionary fluke or a magical creature. He simply exists as an impossibility everyone accepts without question. That acceptance is itself suspicious, hinting at something about Brian's nature that the characters know but never discuss openly. If his abilities came from government experimentation, it would explain both why he is unique and why nobody questions his existence. The American Dad connection provides crucial support for the notion of government experimentation on animals producing human-level intelligence. American Dad, created by Seth MacFarlane and sharing a universe with Family Guy, features Roger the Alien and has shown numerous CIA experiments involving consciousness transfer, memory manipulation, and the creation of hybrid beings. The CIA in this universe regularly performs unethical experiments that violate every scientific and moral boundary, possessing both the technology and the total lack of ethics required to move human consciousness into animal bodies. Crossover episodes and references confirm the two shows share the same reality, which means the CIA capabilities shown in American Dad exist in Brian's world too. If the agency can transfer consciousness in one show, it can do it in the other. Brian's origin story raises immediate red flags. The show has revealed very little about his early life before he met Peter. He mentions his mother and a difficult puppyhood, but the details stay vague and contradictory, and the show seems deliberately evasive about where he came from and how he became what he is. In one episode, Brian meets his mother, a normal dog without human intelligence or speech. She does not talk, behaves like an ordinary animal, and offers no explanation for why her son is radically different. If Brian were born naturally to a normal dog mother, he should be a normal dog. His exceptional abilities make no genetic sense unless something happened to him after birth that fundamentally altered his nature. The theory proposes that Brian was originally human, possibly someone who volunteered for or was coerced into a CIA experiment promising consciousness transfer or life extension. The experiment moved his human brain or consciousness into a dog's body, perhaps as a test of extending human life by transferring consciousness into younger, healthier bodies. Something went wrong, or perhaps the experiment worked exactly as intended but proved too controversial to continue. So Brian was abandoned or escaped, ending up as a stray before Peter found him. He kept his human intelligence, personality, and memories, but found himself trapped in a dog's form. That explains why he acts human despite being a dog. He is not a dog pretending to be human. He is literally human consciousness inside a dog's body. Brian's existential crisis and depression make far more sense in this light. He is constantly anxious, dissatisfied, and struggling with self-worth issues that run deeper than ordinary personality flaws. He drinks heavily, uses drugs, and shows signs of deep psychological trauma. He writes novels and chases artistic recognition with desperate intensity, as though proving his humanity through creative work. He forms romantic relationships with human women and is not just heartbroken, but existentially crushed when they fail. Those reactions suggest someone trying to reclaim or prove a human identity rather than a dog who happens to be smart. If Brian was human before the experiment, his depression stems from being trapped in a form that prevents him from living as who he really is. He cannot fully integrate into human society because he is physically a dog, and he cannot accept being a dog because he is mentally human. The way other characters treat Brian oscillates between accepting him as human and reminding him he is a dog, creating a cognitive dissonance the theory explains perfectly. Sometimes the Griffins treat him as a full family member who eats at the table and participates equally. Other times they remind him he is a dog by making him sleep on the floor, putting him on a leash, or telling him to remember his place. That inconsistent treatment would be psychologically devastating for someone who was once fully human. The family knows on some level that Brian is different from other dogs, possibly because Peter was told about his origin when he adopted him. But they cannot fully reconcile treating a dog-shaped being as completely human, and their inconsistency reflects their confusion about what he actually is. Brian's relationship with Stewie becomes crucial evidence here. Stewie is a genius who builds time machines, clones, and advanced technology that rivals or exceeds CIA capabilities, and he understands science and consciousness deeply enough to detect whether Brian's brain structure had been artificially modified or transplanted. The fact that Stewie forms his closest bond with Brian, supposedly just a dog, suggests he recognizes something extraordinary about Brian's consciousness. Stewie treats him as an intellectual equal and closest friend, which he would not do if Brian were merely a smart dog. Stewie may have analyzed Brian's brain and discovered the truth, but keeps it secret, because revealing it would destroy Brian psychologically or put him in danger from whatever agency created him. Several episodes feature Brian having flashbacks or memories inconsistent with having lived his entire life as a dog. He references experiences and knowledge a dog should not possess, even a very intelligent one, understanding complex human social dynamics, historical events, and cultural references in ways that suggest lived experience rather than learned knowledge. Some of his memories, when described, sound like they could come from a human life he either cannot fully access or has rationalized as part of his dog experience. The show never dwells on these inconsistencies, but they accumulate to suggest his memories do not entirely match the life he claims to have lived. His physical capabilities exceed what a dog's body should manage. He walks upright consistently, which is extremely difficult and unnatural for canine anatomy. He manipulates objects with paws lacking opposable thumbs, yet types on computers, opens doors, and uses tools with human dexterity. His vocal cords produce perfect human speech, despite dogs lacking the structures required for complex language. Those impossible feats suggest his body has been modified beyond normal dog anatomy. A brain transplant experiment would likely include physical modifications to make the dog body capable of executing human intentions, altering the vocal cords, adjusting the spine and limbs for bipedal movement, and modifying the paws for object manipulation. Brian's body is not entirely dog anymore, but a hybrid creation designed to house human consciousness. The show has directly questioned or explored Brian's humanity in ways that support the theory. In one episode, he tries to join the police force and faces discrimination for being a dog, despite being clearly more qualified than the human applicants. The legal and social system cannot process what he is because he defies categorization. He is not human enough to have full human rights, but too human to be treated as a pet, and that liminal status creates constant problems the show plays for comedy, but which would be genuinely nightmarish for someone trapped between species. If Brian was human and knows it, this discrimination is not just unfair treatment, but a systematic denial of his true identity. Another episode showed him having a near-death experience in which he confronts mortality and questions his existence. His fear of death goes beyond ordinary survival instinct and touches on existential dread about what happens to a transplanted consciousness after the body dies. If his consciousness was moved from a human body into a dog's, he faces the terrifying uncertainty of whether it is now bound to the dog body or whether death would finally free him, and he might also fear that his original human body died years ago, so that every day is a reminder that he should already be dead. The show established that Brian ages in dog years, creating a timeline problem the theory helps solve. He has been with the family for what looks like 15 to 20 years of show time, so by dog aging he should be elderly or dead, yet he remains relatively young and healthy. If his consciousness is human and his body has been artificially modified, his aging might be slowed or altered by the same technology that made his existence possible. The CIA would want to extend the lifespan of experimental subjects to gather long-term data, so life extension modifications might have been built into the procedure. His aging inconsistency suggests his body does not follow normal biological rules because it is an engineered hybrid rather than a natural dog. His sexual attraction to human women is played as a running joke, but it becomes disturbing evidence within the theory. Dogs do not feel sexual attraction to humans because they are different species, yet Brian consistently pursues, dates, and has relationships with human women, depicted as genuine attraction rather than aberrant behavior. If he retains human sexual attraction and human consciousness, pursuing human women makes perfect sense. He is drawn to humans because he is mentally human, regardless of his form. The fact that some women reciprocate suggests they recognize something human in him that transcends his dog appearance, which would not happen if he were truly a dog, no matter how intelligent. The theory explains why Brian is so invested in human political and social issues. He reads newspapers obsessively, follows politics closely, and holds strong opinions about human society and culture. A naturally evolved intelligent dog would likely develop a perspective separate from human concerns, but Brian's worldview is entirely human. He cares about human problems because they are his problems. He was part of human society before the experiment, and he desperately wants to stay connected to that world despite his transformation. His activism and intellectual pursuits are attempts to maintain his human identity and prove he still belongs. Several characters throughout the series have reacted to Brian with shock or confusion when first meeting him, suggesting they instinctively perceive something deeply wrong before accepting him. Such reactions happen less as the show goes on, because those who know Brian grow used to him, but new characters sometimes show visible disturbance before adjusting. That pattern suggests people instinctively recognize Brian as an anomaly, something that should not exist, before social pressure and his own behavior convince them to ignore their instincts. If he is the product of illegal experimentation, people might sense something unnatural about him without being able to name it. The show has referenced government conspiracies, cover-ups, and experiments in numerous episodes across both series, establishing a universe full of secret programs performing horrific experiments without public knowledge or consent. The CIA has been shown doing mind control, creating super soldiers, developing biological weapons, and conducting human experimentation, and consciousness transfer fits perfectly within that established range of unethical projects. The fact that the shows keep returning to these themes suggests the writers are building a consistent universe where such projects exist and carry real consequences. Brian's name is notably human, rather than a typical dog name like Spot or Rex. Most people give pets simple, cute names, but Brian carries a formal human name suggesting identity rather than ownership. If Peter adopted him, knowing he housed a human consciousness, he might have asked Brian his name rather than imposing a pet name. Brian could be his actual human name from before the experiment, or a name he chose to hold onto his human identity. Either way, the name signals a self-determined identity rather than one assigned by an owner. The theory also explains his complicated relationship with his dog Nature. He sometimes performs dog behaviors like sniffing or chasing tennis balls, then immediately shows shame or confusion about the impulse. If human consciousness was transplanted into a dog brain, some canine instincts might remain in the brain tissue itself or in the body's autonomic responses, so Brian would experience confusing moments where dog instincts override his human consciousness, producing behavior that feels alien to his sense of self. His shame stems from those moments reminding him he is trapped in a dog's body, with dog biology affecting his supposedly human mind. Episodes where he suffers memory loss or altered consciousness show inconsistencies that support this. When his memories are affected, dog-like behaviors sometimes emerge more strongly, as if removing his human consciousness exposes the dog brain beneath, and other times his personality fragments in ways suggesting multiple layers rather than a unified identity, hinting that his consciousness is not naturally integrated with his body, but exists as an overlay that can be disrupted. The show has never revealed who Brian's father is or offered information about his breeding, which is suspicious for a dog the Griffins have known for years. If he were a normal dog with an unusual mutation, his genetics would be fascinating and worth exploring. So the complete lack of investigation into his origins suggests the truth is either deliberately hidden or too dangerous to pursue. Peter might have agreed never to ask questions about where Brian came from as a condition of adopting him, and a government agency that creates illegal experimental subjects would want their origins kept secret, possibly monitoring Brian to ensure he never reveals what he is. His success as a writer becomes more plausible if he was originally an educated human with writing experience. His novels and scripts show genuine literary ambition and skill that would be nearly impossible for even the most intelligent dog to develop, since writing requires not just intelligence, but years of education, cultural knowledge, and practice. If Brian was a writer or intellectual before the experiment, he would already possess all the background required, and his struggle to be recognized would stem not from lack of talent, but from the impossibility of being taken seriously as a dog author. Publishers and critics unable to reconcile the quality of his work with his physical form. The timing of when Peter found Brian also raises questions. Peter came across him as a stray at a convenient moment when the family needed a pet, and the show has never explained why Brian was on the street or how he ended up there. If he was an escaped or abandoned government experiment, he would have been living as a stray while trying to survive in a form that made integration into society nearly impossible. And Peter finding him might not have been coincidence, but the result of the agency that created him, allowing him to be adopted by a normal family as part of long-term observation. The Griffins could be unknowingly monitored to see how a transplanted consciousness adapts to domestic life over years. Brian's alcoholism takes on darker meaning as a way to cope with the horror of his situation. He drinks far more than addiction alone would explain. If he knows he was human and is now trapped as a dog, alcohol becomes his only escape from that unbearable reality. He cannot seek therapy because explaining his true situation would sound insane. He cannot form genuine intimate relationships because his physical form blocks true acceptance. He cannot reclaim his human life because that person officially died or vanished when the experiment occurred. Drinking numbs the constant awareness that he is living a nightmare with no possibility of waking. Somewhere in this universe, the theory suggests, files exist documenting Brian's creation, records the agency kept of its subjects, including his original human identity, the circumstances of the transplant, and years of monitoring data. If revealed, those files would answer every question about his origin and prove he is not a natural occurrence, but a created being, and the show could eventually use them to explore his past and confront him with a truth he either represses or genuinely does not remember. Looking at the canon, Brian exhibits every characteristic of human consciousness trapped in a non-human form: his intelligence, behavior, desires, knowledge, and psychological profile, all pointing towards someone who was human and retains that identity despite physical transformation, an impossible hybrid forever caught between two species and fully belonging to neither. If this breakdown is keeping you company, go ahead and subscribe before the next section. That brings us to the theory that Brian is actually the one writing Family Guy. One of the most mind-bending ideas about the show proposes that the entire series is really a novel or screenplay authored by Brian Griffin, and everything we watch is filtered through his perspective as the writer. In this reading, Brian is not merely a character in Family Guy, but the creator of the story itself, and the show's bizarre structure, inconsistent logic, and self-aware humor all reflect the chaotic process of Brian writing and rewriting his magnum opus. He has been documenting his life with the Griffin family as a semi-autobiographical work, which explains why he appears as such a central and sympathetic figure despite being a dog, why the show constantly breaks its own reality, and why everything resets between episodes. Examine his writing career, his creative struggles, and how the show functions narratively, and this meta-reading finds substantial support in moments that suggest someone is actively constructing this reality rather than simply living in it. The foundation is the undeniable fact that Brian is a writer who is always working on novels, screenplays, and other creative projects. Writing is not a hobby for him, but his primary identity and life purpose. He introduces himself as a writer before mentioning anything else about who he is, and he spends countless episodes laboring over manuscripts, pitching ideas, and desperately seeking publication. The show has established that Brian pours his life experiences into his work and uses it to process his existence. If he writes about his life obsessively, it follows that Family Guy itself could be his most ambitious project, a sprawling narrative about the Griffin family that he continues writing episode after episode, year after year. The show's format mirrors exactly how a struggling writer would build a long-form narrative. Each episode functions as a chapter or standalone story within a larger work. Some connect to ongoing storylines, while others stand alone. The quality swings wildly from one episode to the next, some brilliantly crafted and others feeling rushed or half-baked. That inconsistency matches what you would expect from a writer producing hundreds of chapters over decades. Brian has good writing days and bad ones. Sometimes he is inspired and creates something special. Other times he is blocked or lazy and churns out filler just to meet his self-imposed deadline of keeping the story going. The uneven quality is not a bug, but a feature revealing the writer behind it struggling with his craft. His own novels and scripts within the show reveal how he approaches storytelling. When Brian writes, he always inserts himself as a character, usually as the hero or the smartest person in the room. His work is semi-autobiographical to the point of narcissism, full of transparent self-inserts with dialogue that makes him look smart, cultured, and morally superior. Family Guy follows the same pattern with Brian as a character. Despite being a dog, he is portrayed as one of the smartest characters, the voice of reason, and the moral center. He gets storylines in which he is sexually desirable to human women, intellectually respected, and artistically talented. These characterizations make no sense objectively, but perfect sense if Brian is writing himself into the story, granting himself the role he wishes he had in real life, because he controls the narrative. The show's political and social commentary aligns precisely with Brian's established worldview. Family Guy takes clear positions on politics, religion, and social issues that match Brian's liberal ideology, mocking conservatives, organized religion, and traditional values, while defending progressive causes and secular humanism. It is not subtle. The show's political stance is Brian's stance, because Brian is writing it and cannot help injecting his opinions into every episode. When other characters express conservative views, they are usually portrayed as stupid or wrong, reflecting his bias as the author. He builds straw-man arguments against his own beliefs and then has himself or like-minded characters easily defeat them. The show's politics are not objective satire, but Brian's personal political diary, where he gets to win every argument. The cutaway gags make perfect sense as Brian's writing technique. When telling a story, his mind wanders, and he tosses in tangential references, memories, and jokes that have nothing to do with the main narrative. Those cutaways represent his actual thought process as he writes. He begins describing a scene, remembers something funny from history or pop culture, includes it as a cutaway, and then returns to the main story. The cutaways are not part of the Griffin's reality, but part of Brian's narrative construction. He is building the story in real time, getting distracted, adding jokes, and continuing. The fact that cutaways happen mid-conversation and other characters do not acknowledge them fits, because they exist on the meta level of Brian writing, rather than on the level of the characters living the story. Peter's characterization as increasingly stupid and chaotic reflects Brian's growing resentment and frustration with him. In Brian's early writing, Peter was dumb but lovable. As their real friendship deteriorated, Brian began writing him as more obnoxious, more destructive, and more irredeemable. The degradation of Peter's character is not bad writing, but intentional character assassination by Brian, who uses his narrative power to punish Peter for whatever slights and frustrations occurred between them. Every episode where Peter does something horrible to Brian is Brian processing real conflicts through fiction, and every time Peter is portrayed as a monster, Brian is venting genuine anger through the safety of storytelling. The show has become Brian's therapy and his revenge at once. Lois's characterization reveals his complex feelings about her. In many episodes, she is the reasonable adult managing chaos, reflecting Brian's respect. In others, she is sexually promiscuous, manipulative, or cruel, reflecting his resentment that she is married to Peter instead of available to him. Brian has been attracted to Lois throughout the series, and that attraction colors how he writes her. She is both idealized and degraded, depending on his mood and his current feelings about his unrequited desire. When he feels rejected by her, he writes episodes where she is flawed or makes terrible decisions. When he feels warmly toward her, he writes her as sympathetic and admirable. Her inconsistent characterization reflects his inconsistent feelings. Stewie gets special treatment because he is Brian's best friend in real life. The show gives Brian and Stewie extensive storylines together, deep conversations, and a genuine emotional bond that surpasses every other relationship. Brian writes Stewie as a genius because he truly admires Stewie's intelligence, and he writes their friendship as the emotional core of the show because it is the emotional core of his actual life. The road trip and time travel adventures are Brian's way of documenting and celebrating that friendship, creating scenarios where they can have meaningful conversations and share experiences because those moments matter to him personally. Stewie is the only character Brian consistently writes with depth and affection because Stewie is the only person Brian truly respects and loves. Meg's treatment becomes darkly revealing here. Brian takes part in abusing Meg despite positioning himself as the moral character. If he is writing the show, he is deliberately choosing to make her the family punching bag. That could reflect genuine cruelty or his discomfort with Meg's real-life attraction to him. Several episodes have shown Meg with romantic or sexual interest in Brian, and he finds the attention disturbing. By writing her as pathetic and undesirable, he ensures any attraction between them reads as inappropriate and one-sided, using the narrative to create distance while working through his guilt about rejecting her by occasionally giving her episodes where she stands up for herself or receives validation. The show's constant fourth wall breaking and self-awareness fit perfectly if Brian is actively writing it. Characters reference being in a television show, acknowledge the audience, and comment on the show's structure. Those moments are Brian stepping outside his narrative to acknowledge his role as author. When characters break the fourth wall, he is breaking his own fictional construct to remind himself and the audience that this is a created work. He cannot maintain the illusion consistently because he is too self-conscious about the act of creation, and every meta-joke is Brian winking at himself about what he is doing, simultaneously creating the story and commenting on the process of creating it. Episodes about Brian's writing process mirror the structure and problems of Family Guy itself. When he writes a novel or screenplay within the show, he faces criticism that his work is derivative, poorly structured, self-indulgent, and tries too hard to be edgy. Criticisms that apply directly to Family Guy as a show. If Brian is writing it, these self-critical episodes are him processing real criticism he has received. He includes characters telling him his writing is bad because part of him knows it is bad, but he continues anyway because writing is all he has. The show grows more self-aware about its flaws over time, matching Brian becoming more aware of his limitations as a writer while being unable to stop. The treatment of death and consequences supports the idea that Brian controls the narrative. Characters die and come back because he changes his mind about killing them off. Locations appear and vanish because he forgets what he established or decides to retcon his own continuity. The timeline makes no sense because he is bad at tracking chronology in a long-term narrative. Everything that looks like sloppy writing becomes intentional characterization of Brian as a sloppy writer. The show's flaws are his flaws as an author, and recognizing that reframes every inconsistency as evidence for the theory rather than against it. Brian's death and resurrection arc is the most significant evidence of all. When he died after being hit by a car, the show continued for several episodes without him before Stewie used time travel to prevent his death. In the meta reading, Brian wrote himself dying to explore what the show would be like without him and what his legacy would be. He needed to know if he mattered, so he removed himself temporarily. The overwhelming grief the family expressed, especially Stewie, was Brian writing the reaction he hopes people would have if he died. He brought himself back because he could not commit to ending his own story and because the narrative did not work without him as author. His death arc was him experimenting with mortality through fiction and ultimately deciding he was not ready to end his chronicle. The liberal use of celebrity cameos and pop culture references reflects his desperation to seem current and culturally relevant. Brian is obsessed with being seen as intelligent and sophisticated, so he fills his narrative with references demonstrating his knowledge of movies, music, politics, and literature. The cutaways often feature historical figures or celebrities because he wants to show off everything he knows, including them compulsively even when they do not serve the story, because they serve his need for validation. Every reference is Brian shouting that he knows about this thing to an audience he hopes will be impressed. The show's increasing darkness reflects his growing cynicism and depression. Early Family Guy had relatively innocent humor within a family sitcom structure. Later seasons include jokes about death, violence, sexual assault, and other dark subjects that push boundaries aggressively. That tonal shift matches Brian's personal decline. As he grows more alcoholic, more depressed, and more disillusioned, the show he writes becomes darker and more nihilistic, his mental state bleeding into his work until the comedy is tinged with genuine bitterness and pain. The show gets meaner because Brian is getting meaner toward others and toward himself. Episodes focused on Brian's failures as a writer take on new meaning if he is writing the show. When his novel is rejected or his screenplay is criticized, he is processing real rejection of Family Guy by critics or audiences, writing himself failing as a way of acknowledging that his work does not get the respect he believes it deserves, but also writing himself persevering and continuing despite failure, which is exactly what he does. The show runs for hundreds of episodes, regardless of critical reception, because Brian refuses to stop, his fictional struggles mirroring his real struggles with the actual narrative. The ensemble structure reflects Brian trying to write objectively about other people while inevitably centering himself. He attempts to give other characters their own storylines and development, but the narrative keeps returning to him. Episodes that supposedly focus on Peter or Lois often carry significant Brian subplots, and he appears in nearly every episode even when his presence is unnecessary. That happens because he writes from his own perspective and cannot escape his subjectivity, trying to create a balanced ensemble but constantly inserting himself because he cannot imagine a world in which he is not present and important. The show's sexual content and Brian's relationships with women reveal wish fulfillment through writing. He dates attractive women who find him desirable despite his being a dog, which makes no logical sense, but perfect sense as fantasy. If Brian is writing the show, he grants himself romantic and sexual success. He likely lacks in reality, inventing women who see past his form and appreciate his intelligence and sensitivity. Those relationships always fail, which could reflect either his actual failed relationships or his inability to imagine himself in a lasting one because his self-loathing runs too deep. The pattern of dating women above his league and then losing them is Brian working through his romantic failures within his fiction. Quagmire's famous speech about why he hates Brian becomes meta-commentary on Brian as a writer. Quagmire lists his flaws in detail, his pretentiousness, his lecturing, his hypocrisy, his narcissism, his lack of self-awareness. If Brian wrote that speech, he is engaging in brutal self-criticism by having another character articulate everything wrong with him. Writers often process their insecurities by voicing their worst fears about themselves through characters, and Brian includes this devastating takedown in his own narrative because part of him knows Quagmire is right. He is everything Quagmire accuses him of being, and writing the speech is his way of acknowledging his flaws while continuing to be exactly who he is, because he cannot change. The show's production and animation style stay consistent across decades while the real world changes around it. If Brian is writing this story, the consistent visual style represents his imagination. He pictures events in a specific artistic style, and that style stays stable because it lives in his mind rather than being produced by an actual studio. The occasional experiments with different animation styles or live-action elements represent Brian trying new creative techniques, challenging himself, and expanding his abilities, as when the show does a Star Wars parody or adopts a different visual approach. The theory explains why the show can run indefinitely without the characters aging or the premise fundamentally changing. Brian is not documenting events as they happen, but creating an ongoing fictional narrative based loosely on his life. He keeps the characters frozen at specific ages because that is when he started writing them, and he does not want to deal with the complications of aging them. The floating timeline, in which modern technology appears but the characters stay the same age, is a feature of his writing rather than a bug. He updates cultural references and current events while keeping the character dynamics stable, because that is easier than writing characters who genuinely grow and change. His alcoholism is both a plot point and likely a factor in the show's creation. If Brian writes Family Guy while drinking, his intoxication would explain the chaotic structure, the random digressions, and the occasional lapses in logic or taste. Some episodes feel drunk because he was drunk when he wrote them, the cutaways growing more random, and the humor darker as episodes progress, mirroring how his inhibitions dissolve as he drinks while writing. The show is the product of thousands of hours of Brian at his computer with a glass of wine, typing out his interpretation of his life and his fantasies about what it could be. Episodes showing alternate versions of events or restarting from different premises represent him revising his work, constantly reconsidering his choices, and imagining how the story would differ with other decisions, including these alternate timelines, because he cannot stop exploring every possibility, unable to commit to a single definitive version. The contradictions and retcons are his editing process made visible. The show's relationship with the Fox network and censorship can be read as Brian's relationship with publishers and editors. Family Guy pushes boundaries and includes controversial content that supposedly risks cancellation, mirroring how his work is supposedly too edgy and intellectual for mainstream acceptance. When the show references its own cancellation and return, Brian is writing about his manuscript being rejected and then accepted, the network becoming a character in his meta-narrative about the struggle to get his work seen and appreciated by audiences he believes may not be sophisticated enough to understand it. Viewed through this lens, Family Guy exhibits every characteristic of being Brian's semi-autobiographical novel. It centers him, despite his being a dog, because he is the author, reflects his politics, his writing style, his psychological issues, and his creative limitations, breaks its own reality, because he is self-conscious about creation, includes devastating criticism of him because he is aware of his flaws, and continues indefinitely because he cannot stop writing about himself and the family he lives with. Family Guy is not what happens to these characters. It is what Brian writes about what happens to them, filtered through his perspective, limited by his abilities, and shaped by his desperate need to create something meaningful that will outlive him. The show is his legacy, his therapy, his revenge, his fantasy, and his prison, all bound together in an endless narrative he can neither perfect nor abandon. Do subscribe before we move on if you are enjoying the breakdown. Next, we turn to Meg Griffin and the theory that she is Stewie's biological mother. One of the most disturbing and widely discussed ideas about the show suggests Stewie is not Lois and Peter's third child, but Meg's biological son from a teenage pregnancy the family covered up to avoid scandal. In this reading, Lois and Peter agreed to raise Stewie as their own, while Meg was forced to give up her baby and pretend to be his sister rather than his mother. The family's extreme mistreatment of Meg stems from resentment about the situation. Various jokes throughout the series serve as hints about the truth, and the age gaps and relationship dynamics in the family only make sense if Stewie is actually Meg's child. Examine the throwaway jokes, the character ages, the family dynamics, and specific episodes that hint at dark secrets, and the theory finds disturbing support in moments that suggest something fundamentally wrong about Stewie's place in the family structure. The starting point is the ages and timeline of the Griffin children. Meg is 17 throughout most of the series, Chris appears to be around 13 or 14, and Stewie is roughly a year old, despite the show running more than 20 years. If we assume the characters were their current ages when the show began in 1999, Meg would have been around 16 or 17 then, which means Stewie was born when Meg was approximately 15 or 16, exactly the age at which a teenage pregnancy would occur. The spacing between Meg and Chris makes sense for planned children, but the gap between Chris and Stewie is much larger, which could indicate that Stewie was not a planned pregnancy, but an unexpected situation years after Lois and Peter thought they were done having children, or that Stewie is not Lois's biological child at all. The way the family treats Meg compared to the other children reveals a disturbing pattern the theory explains. Peter openly states he does not love her and treats her with contempt and cruelty. Lois takes part in the abuse and sometimes seems to resent her daughter's existence. Chris and Stewie join in, mocking and dismissing her. The whole family has cast Meg as the scapegoat who absorbs all blame and abuse, and that goes far beyond normal sibling rivalry or sitcom dynamics into what resembles genuine hatred and resentment. If Meg had a baby as a teenager that disrupted the family and forced Lois and Peter to raise an additional child they did not want, their resentment would make sense. They blame her for the chaos, the expense, and the social embarrassment of the situation, and they punish her through constant emotional abuse. Meg is hated not because she is inherently worthless, but because she committed an unforgivable act the family cannot openly acknowledge. Lois's age and circumstances when Stewie was born raise red flags. She would have been in her late 30s or early 40s if he is her biological child. While women can certainly have children at that age, it becomes less common and more difficult, and the show has never explained why Lois and Peter decided to have another child so many years after Chris. They never discuss planning for Stewie or wanting another baby. He simply exists with no backstory about his conception or birth. That absence is suspicious. If Stewie were Meg's child, Lois and Peter would not talk about planning for him, because he was not planned. They took over raising him to protect Meg and preserve the family's reputation, but they never wanted him themselves. Several episodes have included jokes about Meg's sexual history or past relationships that could be hints about a teenage pregnancy. The show has referenced Meg being sexually active at a young age or having experiences that damaged her psychologically. While these are often just crude jokes, they could also be the show's way of acknowledging that something significant happened in her past involving sex and consequences. Family Guy frequently buries dark truths in throwaway jokes that seem meaningless until you realize they are consistent hints about a deeper storyline, and the repeated jokes about her sexual past could be breadcrumbs leading to the revelation that she had a baby as a teenager. Stewie and Meg's relationship differs from typical sibling dynamics in ways that support the theory. Stewie is cruel to Meg like the rest of the family, but there are occasional moments of tenderness or connection that feel out of place. A few episodes have shown Meg protecting Stewie or showing maternal concern beyond typical sibling care, and when Stewie is in danger, she sometimes reacts with an intensity that suggests deeper attachment than a sister would feel. Such moments are rare because the show mostly maintains the fiction that she is just his sister, but they appear often enough to imply an underlying bond the narrative cannot fully suppress. If Meg is Stewie's biological mother, she would naturally feel protective and loving toward him, even while forced to keep her distance and pretend he is her brother. The show has established that the Griffins keep massive secrets and run cover-ups regularly. Multiple episodes have revealed that Lois has a criminal past, that Peter's father was not his biological father, and that various family members have hidden identities or secret histories. The family is demonstrably capable of maintaining elaborate lies over long periods, so if Lois and Peter decided to raise Meg's baby as their own, they would absolutely be capable of maintaining that fiction indefinitely. Their willingness to lie about fundamental aspects of their history is canonical and well established, and a cover-up about Stewie's parentage fits perfectly within that existing pattern of deception. Brian's role becomes significant because he would almost certainly know the truth. He has been with the family since before Stewie was born and is portrayed as Lois's confidant and closest friend, besides Peter. If Meg had a teenage pregnancy, Lois would likely have discussed it with Brian and relied on him for support during the crisis. His complicated relationship with the family's secrets and his heavy drinking could be partly explained by guilt over participating in the cover-up. He knows Stewie is Meg's son, he knows the family's treatment of Meg is connected to the secret, and he says nothing because revealing the truth would destroy multiple lives. His alcoholism could be partly about numbing the guilt of watching Meg suffer for a mistake she made as a child while being denied her own baby. The show has made specific jokes that directly reference the possibility of Stewie being Meg's child. In at least one episode, a character comments about Stewie possibly being Meg's baby, and the joke is dismissed or passed over quickly. Family Guy often uses this technique of stating something true as a joke and then moving on as if it were random humor, and it has a history of hiding major reveals in plain sight by framing them as absurd jokes audiences dismiss. When a show repeatedly makes the same joke about a character relationship, it often signals that the joke is truth disguised as humor, and the fact that the show has explicitly referenced this theory within episodes suggests the writers are aware of it and may be planting evidence. Meg's depression, anxiety, and desperate need for acceptance make more sense in the context of having given up a child. Teenage mothers who give up their babies for adoption, or who are forced to pretend their child is a sibling, often suffer severe psychological consequences, including depression, identity confusion, and difficulty forming relationships, and Meg exhibits all of these throughout the series. She is desperately lonely, struggles to connect with peers, has extremely low self-esteem, and seems psychologically damaged in ways beyond normal teenage angst. If she gave birth to Stewie and then had to watch Lois raise him as her own while being forbidden to claim him as her son, that trauma would explain her state perfectly. She lives in the same house as her biological child, but cannot acknowledge their true relationship, which would be absolutely devastating. The theory explains why Meg stays with the family despite the abuse. Teenagers who are abused often leave home as soon as possible, but Meg stays despite every reason to escape. If Stewie is her son, she cannot leave, because leaving would mean abandoning her child. She endures the family's cruelty because staying close to Stewie matters more than her own well-being, and her inability to leave a toxic environment makes sense if she is driven by maternal love. For a child she gave up but still wants to be near. The few times she has tried to leave, she always comes back, which could indicate that her attachment to Stewie keeps pulling her home. Lois's complex feelings towards Stewie could reflect resentment about raising her daughter's child rather than genuine maternal love. The show depicts her as sometimes affectionate towards Stewie, but often frustrated by him or barely tolerating his presence, without the instinctive maternal warmth mothers typically show a baby. That emotional distance makes sense if Stewie represents a burden she took on reluctantly to save her daughter's reputation. She loves him because she committed to raising him, but she also resents him because he was not her choice, and his existence constantly reminds her of Meg's mistake and the family secret they maintain. Peter's complete disinterest in Stewie as a baby could indicate he knows Stewie is not his biological child. Peter largely ignores Stewie and shows little paternal instinct, treating him more like a strange roommate than a son. That distance could reflect his knowledge that Stewie is really his grandson rather than his son. Peter agreed to the cover-up to protect Meg and preserve the family's reputation, but he cannot force himself to feel fatherly love for a child he knows is not really his. His indifference towards Stewie mirrors his hatred toward Meg, because both emotions spring from the same source: resentment about the situation Meg created. If his father was exceptionally intelligent, perhaps an older student or adult, Stewie's extraordinary capabilities would come from that lineage rather than being unexplained anomalies, grounding his character in biological reality rather than impossible cartoon logic. The show could reveal that Stewie's father was a prodigy or genius Meg had a relationship with before the family shut down all discussion of that time. The show has depicted Stewie with matricidal fixations toward Lois, which reads differently if Lois is not his biological mother. His desire to kill her could stem from a subconscious awareness that she is not really his mother. Children sometimes sense when family relationships are not what they are told, and Stewie's hostility could indicate he instinctively knows something is wrong. His elaborate plans to murder her represent his subconscious rage about being separated from his real mother and forced into a family structure built on lies. Meanwhile, Stewie never expresses a desire to harm Meg, which could indicate he subconsciously recognizes her as his actual mother and therefore cannot direct violence toward her. Certain episodes have focused on family secrets, DNA tests, or revelations about true parentage in ways that could be setting up this reveal. The show has established that Griffin family members are not always biologically related to who they think, as when Peter discovered his real father was not Francis Griffin, but another man. The show has demonstrated it is willing to completely rewrite family relationships through shocking revelations. So, if it can reveal Peter's father is not his real father, it can reveal Stewie's mother is not his real mother. The precedent for this kind of massive family secret already exists. Meg's occasional moments of standing up for herself often center on her declaring that the family needs her more than they admit. In one significant episode, she explains that she accepts the family's abuse because someone needs to be the target, and that without her, the family would turn on each other. That speech reveals she understands her role in maintaining stability, and if she is Stewie's mother, her acceptance of abuse could also reflect her belief that enduring mistreatment is the price she pays to stay near her son. She sacrifices her well-being for Stewie's stability, choosing to be the target so he can grow up in a relatively functional household, even if she personally suffers. The show's timeline about when Meg would have been pregnant aligns with periods it has kept deliberately vague. The family's past before the show started is rarely discussed in detail. We know general facts, but lack specifics about what happened year by year, and that vagueness creates space for a teenage pregnancy to have occurred without contradicting established canon. If Meg was pregnant at 15, she would have had the baby right before or right around when the main timeline begins, and the show's refusal to detail those years could be deliberate avoidance of addressing when she was pregnant. Stewie's complete lack of resemblance to Peter supports the theory. Meg looks like Lois and Chris looks like Peter, but Stewie looks like neither parent, with a football-shaped head and features matching neither Lois nor Peter. The show plays this for comedy, but it also raises genetic questions. If Stewie is Meg's child by someone else, his lack of resemblance to Peter makes perfect biological sense. He is not Peter's son, so he does not look like Peter. His features come from Meg and his unknown father, neither of whom look like Peter, so his appearance reflects his actual parentage rather than the parentage everyone claims. The way other characters react to Stewie is revealing. People outside the family often seem confused about him or uncertain how to relate to him, treating him inconsistently as both a baby and something else entirely. That confusion could stem from a subconscious sense that something is wrong with the official story about who Stewie is. If there are rumors in Quahog about Meg having had a baby, people might look at Stewie and wonder if he is that baby, and their inconsistent treatment would reflect their uncertainty about his real identity and place in the family. The show has made jokes about Lois being too old to have babies, or about her fertility declining, which would be accurate for a woman in her late 30s or 40s. Those jokes work as commentary about her age, but they become more significant if she did not actually give birth to Stewie. The show calls attention to the implausibility of Lois having a baby at her age, which could be a hint that she did not have him, but took over raising someone else's child. Comedy often states truth in a way that seems like a joke, and jokes about Lois being too old for babies could be the show signaling that the official story does not make biological sense. Meg's reactions to babies and pregnancy across various episodes could reveal trauma about her own experience. When storylines involve pregnancy or babies, her responses sometimes seem more emotionally intense than the situation warrants, either extreme discomfort or unusual interest, both of which could indicate someone with personal experience of pregnancy and childbirth she cannot openly discuss. Her reactions betray that the topic is not theoretical for her, but deeply personal and traumatic. The show could eventually reveal this truth as a way of explaining and partially redeeming the family's treatment of Meg. If the series ever approaches its ending, or needs a massive shocking reveal, discovering that Stewie is Meg's son would recontextualize everything about the family dynamics, explaining why she is treated so differently, why their relationships are so dysfunctional, and why nobody has intervened in her abuse despite it being obvious and severe. The reveal would not excuse the family's cruelty, but would explain it as stemming from a specific incident and ongoing cover-up, rather than being arbitrary cruelty toward an innocent child. Across hundreds of episodes, the theory finds support in age gaps that do not add up, family dynamics that resemble resentment more than normal sibling conflict, jokes that explicitly float the idea that Stewie is Meg's child, the family's established habit of keeping massive secrets, and Meg's psychological damage that matches someone who gave up a child. Whether the writers intended the reading or fans built it from coincidental details does not matter, because the textual support exists. Stewie's origins stay deliberately vague, Meg's past stays suspiciously blank, and the family's treatment of both makes more sense if they are hiding a devastating secret about who Stewie really is. The theory transforms Family Guy from a show about a dysfunctional family into one about a family broken by a teenage pregnancy they covered up, living with the consequences every day, while the real mother watches someone else raise her child and cannot say a word. Please subscribe before we get into the final theory. That brings us to the theory that Meg and Chris actually died early on, and Peter has been imagining them ever since. One of the darkest ideas circulating in Family Guy discussions holds that Meg and Chris Griffin died as young children, and the teenage versions we see throughout the series exist only in Peter's traumatized imagination. In this reading, Peter caused or failed to prevent his children's deaths years ago, and his broken mind created elaborate fantasy versions of them to cope with unbearable guilt and grief. He imagines what Meg and Chris would be like had they survived and grown up, but his imagination is colored by guilt, producing the twisted family dynamics we see on screen. It would explain why Meg is treated so cruelly, why both children seem emotionally damaged, why the family relationships feel fundamentally wrong, and why Peter's behavior toward his children swings between neglect and occasional genuine emotion. Examine his mental state, the show's treatment of death and reality, and the moments that hint at deep trauma underlying the family, and the theory finds disturbing support in details that suggest Peter's grip on reality is far more tenuous than the show usually admits. The theory first has to identify when and how Meg and Chris died before Peter began imagining their continued existence. The show has featured numerous episodes where his negligence or stupidity puts his children in mortal danger. He has forgotten them in dangerous places, failed to supervise them, driven drunk with them in the car, and made countless decisions that should have killed them. The theory proposes that one of these incidents actually did kill them in reality, but Peter's mind could not accept what he had done, so it constructed an alternate reality in which they survived. Perhaps he crashed the car while driving drunk with young Meg and Chris inside. Perhaps he left them somewhere dangerous, and they died while he was passed out or distracted. Perhaps they drowned, burned, or were killed in a household accident he could have prevented. The specific method matters less than the fact that his negligence led directly to their deaths, creating guilt so massive that his psyche shattered. Peter's established mental problems and tenuous grip on reality support the possibility that he could maintain elaborate delusions for years. The show has depicted him as having suffered brain damage, experienced hallucinations, and demonstrated cognitive impairment so severe that he qualifies as mentally disabled in some episodes. He holds conversations with inanimate objects he believes are real. He cannot distinguish fantasy from reality in many situations. He has false memories and believes things happened that clearly did not. His mind is demonstrably unreliable, which means he is absolutely capable of constructing fantasy versions of dead children and believing they are real. The show has established Peter as someone whose perception cannot be trusted, which lays the psychological foundation for the theory. The way he treats Meg becomes horrifyingly logical if she is a guilt projection rather than his real daughter. Peter tells her he does not love her, forgets her existence regularly, and treats her with contempt that crosses from sitcom meanness into genuine cruelty. That makes no sense if she is his actual living daughter, but perfect sense if she is his imagination's reconstruction of a dead child. In his guilty mind, he does not deserve to have Meg, so his fantasy version of her is someone he cannot love properly. He pushes her away emotionally because his subconscious knows she should not exist. The abuse she endures is his guilt manifesting as cruelty toward the ghost he created, and every time he tells her she is worthless, he is really telling himself he is worthless for what he did. Meg absorbs the punishment Peter believes he deserves, serving as a mirror for his self-loathing. Chris receives different but equally disturbing treatment that fits the theory. Peter shows more affection toward Chris than toward Meg, yet he also treats Chris as stupid and incapable to an extreme degree. If Chris died young, Peter's imagination would have to invent what he would be like as a teenager based on limited information. Peter knew Chris as a child and extrapolated a teenage version, but his guilt and limited imagination produced a Chris who is mentally stunted and emotionally underdeveloped. Fantasy Chris stays childlike because Peter's memories of the real Chris are frozen at whatever age he was when he died. Peter cannot fully picture him as a complex teenager because he never got to see the real Chris grow up, so imaginary Chris stays simple, innocent, and childish even in a teenage body. The show's treatment of death and resurrection supports the idea that the living and dead exist on a continuum in Peter's mind. Characters die and come back regularly with no explanation. Death is temporary, meaningless, and easily reversed. That casual relationship with mortality makes perfect sense if Peter's fantasy world is built around denying that death is permanent. He cannot accept that Meg and Chris are truly dead, so his constructed reality runs on rules where death can always be undone. Every time a character dies and returns, his delusion reinforces itself with the idea that death is not final, and his children could still somehow be alive despite everything his subconscious knows. The age discrepancy between what Meg and Chris should be and what they are could indicate when they actually died. If Meg was 8 and Chris was 5 when they died, but Peter's delusion has been running for 9 years, his fantasy versions would now be 17 and 14. The children never age in the show despite years passing in real time, which fits if they are frozen at the ages Peter imagines them to be. Real children grow and change continuously, but imaginary children change only when Peter consciously updates his fantasy, and he has imagined them at their current ages for so long that he cannot conceive of them aging further, so they remain perpetually 17 and 14 in his delusion. Lois's role in this scenario becomes crucial and deeply sad. If Meg and Chris died, Lois experienced that loss too and knows the children are dead. Her treatment of fantasy Meg could reflect anger at Peter for creating these delusions and forcing her to participate in them. And when she is cruel to Meg, she might be expressing rage at Peter for making her interact with the ghost of their dead daughter. Alternatively, Lois might have broken down completely after losing her children and now participates willingly in Peter's delusion because living in the fantasy is preferable to facing reality. She plays along with his imagined Meg and Chris because the alternative is confronting that her children are dead and her husband killed them. The delusion has become necessary for both parents' survival. Brian's knowledge of the truth would explain his complicated relationship with the family and his drinking. If he was present when Meg and Chris died, he knows they are dead, but chooses not to confront Peter's delusion, because breaking it would destroy Peter completely. Brian watches Peter interact with children who are not there and plays along to protect his friend from a truth too terrible to face. That complicity weighs on his conscience and feeds his alcoholism and depression. He is part of maintaining a mass delusion, and he drinks to numb the guilt of letting Peter live in fantasy rather than helping him face reality and heal. Stewie's existence as a real baby becomes a source of both hope and terror for Peter. Stewie is the only child who is definitely real, because he was born after Meg and Chris died, so Peter can interact with him knowing he is touching an actual living child rather than a projection of guilt. That would explain why Peter largely ignores Stewie despite his being the youngest. Stewie is real, which means Stewie could die just as Meg and Chris did, so Peter keeps his distance as a protective mechanism. He cannot allow himself to love Stewie too much, because losing another real child would shatter even the delusion that keeps him functional. Meanwhile, Stewie's genius and dangerous technology represent real threats. Peter's traumatized mind cannot fully process, so he treats Stewie as less important than the imaginary children he has already lost. The show has featured episodes where Peter's perception is explicitly shown to be false or distorted. He has experienced extended hallucinations, false memories, and alternate realities he believes are real, demonstrating that his mind can construct elaborate fictional scenarios and inhabit them completely. If he can hallucinate entire storylines within single episodes, he can certainly hallucinate ongoing versions of his dead children across years. Each episode could be Peter living through another day in his delusion, creating scenarios and adventures for his imaginary children because his mind cannot stop trying to give them the lives they lost. Meg and Chris's lack of friends, social connections, and lives outside the Griffin house could indicate they are not real. Real teenagers have complex social worlds, including school friends, romantic interests, and activities independent of their parents. Meg and Chris occasionally get storylines about school or friends, but those relationships never develop depth or continuity, and people outside the family barely acknowledge them or treat them as though they scarcely exist. That could be because other people do not see them at all. When Peter imagines taking his children places, other characters play along or ignore the situation because they see him talking to empty space but choose not to confront his obvious mental illness. Quahog has learned to accommodate Peter's delusion rather than challenge it. The theory explains episodes where Meg or Chris temporarily leave the family or disappear. When Meg runs away or Chris goes missing, these storylines represent Peter's delusion, fragmenting temporarily as his subconscious tries to acknowledge the truth. His fantasy children vanish because part of his mind remembers they are actually gone, and then he constructs elaborate scenarios to bring them back because he cannot maintain the fantasy without them. Every departure and return mirrors his consciousness fighting between accepting reality and retreating into delusion, with delusion always winning in the end. Certain episodes show Peter having flashbacks to when Meg and Chris were younger, and those memories often feel emotionally different from the show's usual tone, tinged with a sadness, nostalgia, and loss disproportionate to normal childhood memories. If these flashbacks are Peter's mind, accessing real memories of his children before they died, that emotional weight makes sense. He is remembering the last time he saw them truly alive and happy before the incident took them away. The flashbacks feel melancholy because they are his mind trying to preserve genuine memories of real children even while his current delusion insists those children still exist and have grown up. The family's complete lack of extended family involvement or outside intervention in their dysfunction could indicate that people who knew the real Meg and Chris cannot bear to participate in Peter's delusion. Lois's parents know their grandchildren are dead and probably cannot visit, because watching Peter interact with imaginary versions of them is too painful. Friends and relatives keep their distance because his obvious mental illness and the family's participation in his delusion are disturbing to witness. The Griffins live in isolation, not because they prefer it, but because Peter's breakdown has alienated everyone who knew the truth about what happened to the children. The show's inconsistent continuity regarding Meg and Chris could reflect Peter's imagination constantly revising and updating their characteristics because he lacks a concrete reality to anchor them. Real people have consistent personalities that develop gradually, But imaginary people shift based on what the imaginer needs them to be in any given moment. Meg's personality lurches between meek victim, angry rebel, and desperately needy because she is whatever Peter's guilt needs her to be. And Chris fluctuates between sweet innocent boy and disturbed troubled teen because Peter cannot maintain a consistent image of a son he never saw grow up. Their inconsistency is not bad writing, but an accurate portrayal of how imaginary people lack the coherent development of real individuals. Episodes putting Meg or Chris in danger take on new meaning as Peter's subconscious repeatedly trying to process their actual deaths. When Meg is kidnapped, when Chris is threatened, when either child faces mortality, Peter is forcing himself to relive trauma by imagining his children in danger again. His mind compulsively returns to scenarios where they are at risk because it is trying to process the real scenario where they were at risk and he failed to save them. He constructs these storylines unconsciously as a kind of exposure therapy, trying to desensitize himself to the trauma, but he always resolves them with the children surviving, because accepting their deaths remains impossible. The way Meg and Chris interact lacks the genuine sibling dynamic real siblings develop over years of living together. Their relationship is superficial, with few shared memories or inside jokes, and they exist in parallel rather than being truly connected. That fits if they are both products of the same imagination, rather than two separate people who actually grew up together. Peter imagines them as individuals, but cannot fully imagine the relationship between them, because that requires a level of detail and consistency beyond what his traumatized mind can maintain. They are separate delusions, rather than delusions that interact naturally. The show has made jokes about Meg being forgettable or invisible, including an episode where the family literally forgets she exists. Those jokes are played for comedy, but they also hint that her existence is tenuous and easily erased. If she is imaginary, she would be easily forgotten, lacking the substance and presence of a real person, and Peter's mind sometimes cannot sustain the energy required to imagine her, so she temporarily vanishes from the family's consciousness until his delusion strengthens and brings her back. Her invisibility is not a quirk of personality, but a feature of her being a projection that fades when the projector's power weakens. Chris's episodes about discovering disturbing truths or encountering evil monkeys and other threatening figures could represent fragments of reality breaking into Peter's delusion. The evil monkey in Chris's closet might be a manifestation of truth trying to emerge, a symbolic stand-in for the terrible secret the family is hiding. Chris sees threatening things that other family members dismiss because Fantasy Chris exists closer to the boundary between delusion and reality, and as an imagined version of a dead child, he sometimes channels truth Peter's conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. The show's treatment of Peter's father, Francis Griffin, is relevant because Francis clearly disapproved of how Peter raised his children. Francis's death could connect to the theory if he knew about Meg and Chris's deaths and blamed Peter, perhaps unable to forgive his son for what happened to his grandchildren and dying still angry. Peter's complicated relationship with his father's memory includes guilt that might extend beyond their personal conflicts to encompass Francis's knowledge of Peter's greatest failure as a father. When Peter deals with his father's ghost or memory, he is also dealing with the voice of paternal judgment about the children he lost. Lois's occasional breakdowns and expressions of being overwhelmed by motherhood take on darker meaning if she is pretending to mother children who do not exist. When she screams about how difficult her life is or how much her children exhaust her, she might be expressing the genuine exhaustion of maintaining Peter's delusion while grieving her real dead children. She plays the role of mother to ghosts every day while remembering what it was like to mother real living children, and the performance required to sustain his fantasy while processing her own grief would be crushing, which would explain her moments of complete breakdown. The theory suggests that various neighbors and acquaintances in Quahog either cannot see Meg and Chris at all or choose to ignore the obvious signs of Peter's delusion to avoid an uncomfortable truth. When Meg goes to school or Chris interacts with other kids, these could be either Peter imagining scenarios where his children still have normal lives, or other people indulging his delusion by pretending to interact with them. Quahog as a whole may have decided that maintaining his fantasy is kinder than forcing him to face that he killed his children, so the entire town participates in a collective fiction. The show's frequent road trip and adventure episodes with the family could represent Peter's attempts to create happy memories with imaginary versions of children he never got to take on real adventures. He imagines elaborate vacations and experiences with Meg and Chris because he is trying to give them the childhood they lost. Every family adventure, a guilt-driven attempt to compensate for the life he took from them by imagining a better, more exciting one than they actually had. The adventures are often chaotic and dangerous because his traumatized mind cannot imagine purely positive experiences. His guilt ensures that even his fantasies contain threat and failure. Certain episodes show alternate timelines or realities where the family is configured differently, and sometimes in those alternates, Meg and Chris do not exist or exist very differently. These could be Peter's mind briefly glimpsing actual reality, where his children are dead, before the delusion reasserts itself and brings them back. When the show depicts reality shifting or multiple timelines, it is showing his consciousness flickering between delusion and truth, with delusion always ultimately winning because truth is unbearable. The episode where Meg finally stands up to the family and explains that she accepts their abuse to keep the family stable takes on devastating new meaning in this context. If she is Peter's guilt projection, that speech represents his subconscious understanding that his fantasy Meg exists specifically to absorb the punishment he believes he deserves. She articulates the psychological function she serves in his delusion. She exists to be hurt because Peter needs to hurt himself for what he did. And hurting imaginary Meg is how he accomplishes that self-punishment while avoiding direct self-harm that would end his ability to maintain the fantasy. Chris's artistic talent and love of drawing could represent Peter's subconscious trying to preserve what the real Chris loved. If the actual Chris enjoyed art before he died, Peter ensures fantasy. Chris keeps that interest as a way of honoring his son's memory. The traits Peter gives his imagined children are likely based on who they really were, filtered through years of grief and guilt, so fantasy Meg and Chris are distorted versions of the real children, exaggerated and damaged by trauma, but still containing kernels of truth about who those children were before Peter's negligence destroyed them. The show continuing for over 20 years with Meg and Chris never aging makes perfect sense if they died young, and Peter has been imagining them at fixed ages for decades. Time passes in the real world, but his delusion is frozen at the point where he constructed these fantasy children. He decided their ages when he created the fantasy, and they remain those ages forever because his trauma cannot allow them to develop further. Real children who were 8 and 5 when they died 20 years ago would now be 28 and 25 had they lived, but his imagination keeps them perpetually 17 and 14 because that is as far as he can stretch the fantasy. Across the canon, the theory finds support in Peter's established instability, the show's casual treatment of death, the family's dysfunctional dynamics that make more sense as guilt-driven delusion than as real relationships, and the specific ways Meg and Chris are treated that suggest they exist more as concepts than as fully realized people. The theory transforms every episode from a comedy about a dysfunctional family into a tragedy about a man who killed his children and built an elaborate fantasy world to avoid accepting it. Every joke at Meg's expense becomes Peter's guilt punishing itself. Every moment of Chris's innocence becomes Peter trying to preserve what he destroyed, and every family adventure becomes a desperate attempt to give dead children the life they lost. The show is not what happens to the Griffin family, but what Peter imagines happens to the fantasy versions of a family he destroyed, playing out in his broken mind, episode after episode, year after year, with no possibility of healing, because healing would require facing a truth that would destroy him completely. Meg and Chris exist as Peter's elaborate apology and ongoing punishment, ghosts he created to haunt himself forever. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.